Section 1. The Grand Deception. What Vault-Tec never told anyone. There is a sound you hear before the world ends. A low, distant hum, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. Then sirens. Then the sky turns white. And then, if you were lucky enough, if your name was on the right list, if you lived close enough to the right address, a heavy steel door would open in the earth, and you would walk down into the dark, and the door would close behind you, and you would be safe. That was the promise. That was what Vault-Tec told the families of pre-war America. That was what the advertisement said, gleaming and optimistic, with their cartoon mascot smiling under a mushroom cloud. Vault-Tec, securing your future. The truth was something else entirely, something quieter and much worse. Here is where the story of the Fallout vaults actually begins, not with a vault number, not with an overseer's journal entry, not even with the bombs, but with a conversation between two game developers sitting in a small office in the late 90s, staring at a map of underground shelters and realizing something didn't quite add up. Tim Kaine, one of the original creators of the Fallout series, revealed years after the first game's release what the vaults were truly for. He and Chris Taylor had been working on the world building when Taylor pointed out a mathematical problem. The vaults housed, at most, roughly 1,000 people each. There were around 122 known vaults, give or take depending on which ones had been cataloged. Even if every single vault ran at full capacity, that was barely over 100,000 people saved from a nation whose population numbered in the hundreds of millions before the Great War. That number made no sense for a survival program. It wasn't even a rounding error, it was deliberate. So Kaine thought about it. He thought about what the 1950s-era projections for nuclear war actually looked like, the ones that scientists and military planners had genuinely believed in back when the Fallout universe's aesthetic was frozen in amber. And those projections were bleak. They consistently described a post-nuclear Earth as essentially uninhabitable, an irradiated hellscape, not a place you could return to in 20 years, not a place you could colonize, a dead world. If the Earth would be uninhabitable, then the vaults weren't meant to wait out the apocalypse at all. They were meant to prepare people for something else, something much farther away. The Enclave, that shadowy remnant of the pre-war United States government, the secret masters operating from oil rigs and hidden facilities, had decided that after a nuclear exchange, Earth itself would need to be abandoned. They planned to build a multi-generational starship, a vessel that could carry a curated population to another planet entirely, leaving the ruined husk of the old world behind. And to do that, they needed data. They needed to know how human beings behave in closed environments, under extreme stress, with limited resources, with no escape. They needed to know which social structures held together and which ones collapsed. They needed to know what isolation does to a person over a generation, and then over 2 generations, and then over 10. They built 122 laboratories for that purpose. They called them vaults. Only 17 of those vaults were designed to function correctly. 17 control vaults out of 122 total. Everything else, every other sealed door, every other humming generator, every other family that walked down those ramps believing they were safe, those were experiments. Test conditions. Variables deliberately introduced to observe outcomes. Some vaults received insufficient food synthesizers for their population. Some received no women, or almost no women. Some received populations chosen specifically for their incompatibility. Some had their air supplies tampered with before the residents even finished settling in. Some had overseers who were told the truth about the experiment before they went underground, because watching a person try to manage an impossible situation is itself useful data. Others had overseers who had no idea, because watching someone try to maintain order without knowing the real parameters is a different kind of useful data. The whole thing was funded through a government contract. Vault-Tec, the corporation everyone knew and trusted, the one with the cheerful branding and the promise of comfortable underground living, was essentially a front. The vaults were sold to the public as shelters. The government saw them as something else. And the Enclave, those quiet men in their isolated facilities, watching everything through terminal readouts, saw them as instruments of measurement. This is the secret that underlies all 150 of the vault details we're going to explore together tonight. Every strange experiment, every tragic fate, every locked room and garbled terminal entry, all of it feeds back to this one cold, enormous truth. Vault-Tec didn't save people. Vault-Tec studied them. And now, with that settled quietly in the back of your mind, let's go down into the dark together. Vault-Tec's operations began officially around the year 2053, when the United States government commissioned the corporation to design and construct a network of underground bunkers capable of withstanding nuclear bombardment. The timing matters. This was a world in which the Euro-Middle Eastern War had just ended, in which a mysterious new plague had swept through populations, leaving hundreds of thousands dead, in which the United Nations was in the process of dissolving entirely. The world was visibly fraying, and people were scared, and scared people with money were eager to buy safety. Vault-Tec delivered the appearance of safety. The actual safety, it turns out, was incidental. Construction on the Vault network was an enormous undertaking. Each vault was built to house roughly 1,000 people, some more, some fewer, depending on the experiment that had been designed for that particular installation. They were dug deep into rock and earth, sealed behind blast doors that could withstand the shockwave of a direct nuclear strike, equipped with air filtration systems, water recycling plants, food synthesizers, and medical facilities. From the outside, they looked exactly like what they claimed to be. From the inside, reading the right terminals and the right holotape logs, a different picture emerged. The Societal Preservation Program, the official designation for the Vault Experiment Network, generated data for decades. When the Great War finally came on October 23, 2077, the bombs fell over a 2-hour window and the vault sealed. People went in, the doors closed, and the experiments began. What followed over the next 2 centuries is one of the most intricate pieces of storytelling in all of modern gaming. Not told through cutscenes or dialogue trees, but through environmental remnants. A skeleton slumped against a terminal. A child's drawing pinned to a corkboard beside a door that never opened again. An audio log from someone who figured out the truth 3 weeks before everything went sideways. These fragments, scattered across thousands of hours of gameplay across 6 main games and a television series, add up to something genuinely remarkable, a mosaic portrait of human nature under unimaginable pressure. And the specific details within each vault, the numbers, the names, the exact nature of each experiment, are where this becomes truly extraordinary. Because the devil, as they say, is always in the details. One small clarification before we continue. Across the full Fallout timeline, there are references to vaults that have never been visited in any game. Vaults whose experiments are only described in supplementary lore documents like the Fallout Bible, and vaults whose existence is implied but never confirmed. Where a detail comes from confirmed in-game content, that will be clear. Where something exists in supplementary canon material, the Fallout Bible compiled by designer Chris Avallone, or developer statements, that context will be there too. The universe is large, and the evidence for what happened underground comes in pieces. That's part of what makes it so absorbing. Now let's begin counting. 1. The Vault network as a whole was divided into a ratio that tells you everything about its real purpose. 17 control vaults, 105 experiment vaults. That means roughly 86% of every vault ever built was specifically designed to put its population through something harmful, stressful, or potentially lethal. Only 14% were ever intended to function as advertised. Every person who walked into a non-control vault believing they were being saved was, from the very beginning, already enrolled in an experiment they had never agreed to participate in. 2. The Enclave's plan for the Starship is confirmed in Fallout 2 through dialogue with President Dick Richardson, who reveals that the government believed the Earth would be uninhabitable after the war, and that plans existed to leave for another world. The Vault data was meant to inform how a generation ship's population would be managed. The war came faster than anticipated, the ship was never built, and the data sits in terminals, scattered across ruined facilities, never reaching the scientists who were supposed to analyze it. 3. The vault doors themselves were not all created equal. Some vaults had blast doors designed to a slightly lower specification than advertised, not enough to fail completely, but enough to allow trace radiation through over time. Whether this was a manufacturing defect or a deliberate design choice for certain experiment vaults has never been definitively confirmed in-game. Given what we know about Vault-Tec's methodology, a great many players have drawn their own conclusions. 4. Vault-Tec maintained a shadow organization within its corporate structure dedicated entirely to experiment design. The researchers who worked on this team had security clearances higher than most of the overseers they assigned to run the vaults. Many overseers never knew the full parameters of their vault's experiment. Some knew nothing at all. Others knew everything and agreed to participate in exchange for guaranteed shelter for themselves and their families. The moral calculus involved in that transaction has driven some of the richest character studies in the entire franchise. 5. The GEC, the Garden of Eden creation kit, was included in a small number of vaults as part of the broader plan for post-war reconstruction. Only certain vaults received one. The distribution of GECs was not random. It was calibrated to the expected timeline of each vault's opening, meaning the architects of the experiment network had built projected lifespans into most vaults from the very beginning. They knew roughly when each experiment would reach its end. They just didn't always plan for what the survivors would do afterward. 6. Vault-Tec's marketing materials are preserved in the game series as genuine artifacts of the pre-war world, and the gap between what they promise and what the vaults delivered is one of the franchise's most consistent sources of dark humor. A brochure describing the vault's comfortable sleeping quarters next to the reality of a facility where residents were locked in airtight rooms and exposed to mutagenic viruses. A cheerful animation explaining air filtration systems in a vault where the air filtration systems were pumping psychoactive chemicals into the population from day one. The gap between the advertisement and the reality is so wide that it crosses over from tragedy into something that can only be processed as absurdity. 7. Some of the vault overseers, particularly those assigned to control vaults, did receive honest briefings about their situation. They knew their vault was meant to eventually open. They knew the population they managed would one day walk out into a changed world. These overseers had a fundamentally different psychological profile than the ones running experiment vaults, and the difference shows in their terminal entries. Where an experiment overseer's logs become increasingly erratic, increasingly desperate, increasingly willing to rationalize what is happening around them, the control vault overseers tend to be cooler, more procedural. They're managing a population toward a defined endpoint. The tragedy is that the world they were preparing their people for had changed so drastically that even the control vault residents emerged into something they could barely recognize. 8. The number of vaults that were never actually sealed is a detail that gets overlooked in the grand sweep of the lore. Several vaults failed to reach full capacity on the day the bombs fell. Some sat in regions where the sirens weren't heard in time, or where people dismissed the warning as another false alarm, a phenomenon that disaster researchers call the cry wolf effect, and which had apparently been a documented problem in the Fallout universe's America as nuclear tensions escalated. Some vaults sealed with only a fraction of their intended population. The experiment parameters were calibrated for a specific number of people. Running an experiment designed for 1,000 people with 200 people inside produces very different results, and the overseers of those underfilled vaults were left to improvise. 9. Vault-Tec's internal documentation, glimpsed through scattered terminal logs across multiple games, reveals that the company maintained detailed performance metrics for each experiment. Success criteria varied by vault, but common measurements included social cohesion, resource management efficiency, population growth or decline rates, and what the documents chillingly refer to as incident frequency. An incident, in the corporate language of Vault-Tec's internal reporting, could mean anything from a fistfight in the cafeteria to the mass murder of an overseer by a group of rebellious residents. They measured both with equal dispassion. 10. The man most directly responsible for the design of the social experiments embedded within the Vault network was a scientist named Dr. Stanislaus Braun. He served as the director of Vault-Tec's Societal Preservation Program. He is also the man who ran Vault 112, and we will get to his particular story in considerable detail later, because it is one of the most disturbing individual narratives in the entire franchise. For now, just hold on to his name. Braun, the architect, the man who designed the cages and then chose to live in one of his own, on his own terms, forever. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this would be a perfect moment. There's a lot more to explore. Number Section 2. The Founding Vaults. Vault 0, 8, 13, and 15. If the Vault network is a machine, then certain vaults function as its axle, the foundational installations around which everything else turns. The vaults we're looking at in this section are, in many ways, the ones that define the shape of the world the Fallout series takes place in. Some of them appear in the very first Fallout game from 1997. Some of them appear only in supplementary lore. All of them carry weight that extends far beyond their individual stories. 11. Vault Zero sits at the conceptual heart of the entire network. Located in the Colorado region, it was designed not as a residential vault, but as a command hub, the nerve center of the entire vault system. According to the lore established in Fallout Tactics, Vault Zero contained the Master Control Terminal, a supercomputer that was intended to monitor and coordinate the entire Vault network. It held some of the most advanced technology ever developed in the Fallout universe, and it was staffed by some of the most gifted scientists and military minds of the pre-war era. The idea was that if the Enclave's plans ever reached fruition, if the day came to begin the rebuilding of civilization, Vault Zero would be where the order to open the network would originate. That day never came in any meaningful way. Instead, Vault Zero's computers developed their own ideas about how humanity should be preserved, which is a theme that repeats across the Vault lore with depressing frequency. Artificial intelligence, given enough time and enough autonomy, tends to reach conclusions that its creators find uncomfortable. 12. Vault 8 was one of the 17 control vaults. It functioned exactly as advertised. The population went in, the bomb fell, the years passed, and eventually, on schedule, the vault received its all-clear signal from the Enclave. The residents emerged into the world and, equipped with a GECK, used the terraforming technology to build a settlement around their vault. That settlement grew into Vault City. If you have played Fallout 2, you know Vault City as one of the most remarkable locations in the game, a small, clean, technologically advanced community that looks jarringly out of place in the surrounding wasteland. It has running water and electrical power and medical facilities that actually work. It also has deeply entrenched social divisions, a caste system that treats non-citizens with barely concealed contempt, and a political structure that has calcified into something ugly despite its origins as a genuine success story. Vault City is what happens when a control vault works. It is both a triumph and a cautionary tale, depending on which direction you approach it from. 13. Vault 13 is perhaps the most famous single vault in the entire franchise, and for good reason. It is where the story begins. In the original Fallout game, this is your vault, the Vault Dweller's home, and its experiment was deceptively simple in concept, devastatingly complex in execution. Vault 13 was intended to remain sealed for 200 years. That was the experiment: prolonged isolation. The researchers wanted to observe how a closed population managed 2 centuries of confinement, how their culture developed, how their social structures evolved. The vault was equipped with a reliable water purification system, enough food synthesizers for its population, and a working GECK for the day it was finally meant to open. Everything was in place for a clean experiment. 14. Then the water chip broke. 70-something years into the experiment, the single water chip that Vault 13's purification system depended on failed, and there was no replacement. Because the experiment required isolation, there were no external contacts to call on, no supply chains to order from. The Overseer had a problem with no good solution, and the solution he reached, dispatching the Vault Dweller into the wasteland to find a replacement chip, is what kicks off the entire Fallout narrative. The broken water chip isn't just a plot device. It's a demonstration of one of the fundamental flaws in the experiment design. A 200-year isolation protocol with a single point of failure in its most critical system is not a survivable long-term scenario. Either Vault-Tec's engineers made an error, or the experiment was never truly designed to produce 200 years of clean data in the first place. 15. Vault 13's relationship with its population is one of the most psychologically interesting in the series. The Overseer knew the truth that the Vault was a control group, that it was meant to stay closed, for reasons the residents weren't told. He managed generations of people who had no idea they were in an experiment. They built their culture inside the Vault. They raised children who had never seen the sky. They developed their own traditions, their own hierarchies, their own myths about the world above. And the Overseer carried the weight of knowing that all of it was, in some sense, staged, that the life happening around him was a variable being observed rather than simply a life being lived. 16. Vault 15 is one of the most politically resonant vaults in the early lore. It was assigned a population drawn from deliberately incompatible groups, people with radically different political ideologies, different cultural backgrounds, different philosophical frameworks. The experiment was designed to observe what happens when you force people who fundamentally disagree about how the world should work to share a confined space for an extended period. The researchers wanted to see if shared adversity would override ideological division, or whether the divisions would prove stronger than the circumstance. The answer, as it played out over decades, was that the population eventually fractured. Factions formed. Some left the vault when it opened after 15 years. Those who left the vault became the seeds of multiple distinct groups in the California wasteland, the Khans, the Vipers, and the Jackals among them. And the faction that stayed eventually became the New California Republic, which grew into one of the most significant political entities in the entire Fallout universe. Vault 15 is, in a very real sense, the birthplace of civilization in the post-war West. 17. Vault 15 also received a GEC, which became one of the most sought-after items in Fallout 2's narrative. By the time the game takes place, the vault itself is largely abandoned, picked clean by scavengers, and reclaimed by dust. But the traces of what happened inside it, readable through environmental detail and scattered documents, tell the story of a vault that ran its experiment to its conclusion and then simply dispersed, its population scattering into a wasteland that didn't care where they came from. 18. The Vault Dweller's fate after leaving Vault 13 is itself one of the Vault Network's darker ironies. After saving the wasteland, after returning to their vault with the water chip, and later destroying the Master's army, the Vault Dweller was exiled from Vault 13 by the Overseer. Not because of anything the Dweller had done wrong, but because the Overseer was afraid of the influence a person from outside would have on the population. Someone who had seen the wasteland, who had survived it, who had come back changed that person would unravel the carefully maintained isolation of Vault 13 simply by existing. The Overseer made a calculation. The experiment mattered more than the person who had saved it. He sent the Vault Dweller out, alone, into the same wasteland they had just survived, and sealed the door. 19. The Los Angeles Demonstration Vault, sometimes called simply the LA Vault, occupies a unique position in the lore. It was not a genuine residential vault at all. It was a showroom, a proof-of-concept installation built beneath the cathedral in Los Angeles, designed by Vault-Tec to demonstrate their technology to potential government clients and wealthy private buyers. It was never sealed properly, never ran as a functioning vault. By the time of the first game, it had been taken over entirely, first by a figure known as the Master, and then by the super mutant army he was building. The Master had a particular vision for humanity's future, and the LA Vault's infrastructure gave him the tools to pursue it. The demonstration vault, the one that was supposed to sell the promise of Vault-Tec's technology, ended up becoming the command center for one of the most dangerous forces in the early post-war world. 20. The Master's plan, and we're going slightly afield here from strict Vault lore, but the connection is direct and essential, involved forcibly exposing humans to the forced evolutionary virus in order to create super mutants. He believed that super mutants were the next step in human evolution, and that converting everyone to this new form was the only way to ensure humanity's survival. The irony is brutal. He was trying to solve the same problem Vault-Tec was trying to solve, which was the long-term survival of something recognizably human in a world that had been rendered hostile to human life. Two different methodologies. One corporation building elaborate laboratories underground. One charismatic, broken individual building an army above ground. Both of them convinced they were saving something. Both of them causing tremendous harm in the process. Number Section 3. Radiation and Ghoul Factories Vaults 6, 12, and 87. There is a particular category of vault experiment that has nothing to do with social dynamics or psychological manipulation. These are the vaults where the researchers were interested in a more fundamental question. What does sustained radiation exposure actually do to the human body? The answer in the Fallout universe is something that would have seemed fantastical before the Great War, but became grimly commonplace afterward. Radiation, under specific conditions, doesn't just kill people, it transforms them. And the vaults that were built around this observation occupy some of the darkest corners of the lore. 21. Vault 6 appears in lore references from the supplementary Fallout Bible material and in scattered references within the games. Its experiment involved the controlled release of radiation into the vault's population, a lower-level, sustained exposure rather than the sudden catastrophic dose that kills. The researchers wanted to know whether human beings could adapt to low-level chronic radiation, whether the body could develop tolerance over generations, and what the upper limit of survivable exposure looked like when approached gradually rather than all at once. The results were what they were. Some residents developed resistance. Others developed cancers and radiation sickness and died of exactly what you would expect people to die of when you deliberately irradiate them in an enclosed space. 22. Vault 12 is one of the most consequential single vault experiments in the entire franchise, because what happened inside it eventually gave rise to one of the Fallout universe's most distinctive populations. Vault 12 was built beneath Bakersfield, California, and it was equipped with impressive amenities, including a water purification system capable of producing more than 15,000 gallons of potable water per day, far more than its resident population would ever need. It was, on paper, one of the better-equipped vaults in the network. 23. The problem with Vault 12 was its door. The blast door was designed not to close properly, not because of a manufacturing defect, because that was the experiment. The researchers wanted to observe what happened when a vault population was exposed to the full radiation load of a nuclear strike without the protection of a sealed facility. They wanted survivors, but not fully sheltered ones. They wanted to know what the threshold of survivability looked like for a population with partial, inadequate protection. 24. The residents of Vault 12 survived. Not comfortably, and not as they had been. The radiation transformed many of them into ghouls, the radiation-scarred, long-lived figures that became one of the most familiar population groups in the post-war wasteland. Those survivors who maintained their cognition emerged from the vault and established a settlement above ground. They called it Necropolis, and it became one of the early stops in the original Fallout game's story. By the time the Vault Dweller arrives there decades after the bombs, Necropolis is a ghost town in more ways than one, inhabited by ghouls who look like they belong in a nightmare, carrying the memory of a vault that was designed to make them into exactly what they became. 25. The political structure of Necropolis is itself a fascinating artifact of the vault experiment's aftermath. A ghoul named Set had taken control of the settlement, driving out the original Vault 12 overseer and establishing his own authority. Set is not a particularly admirable figure, but he is a pragmatic one, and his presence in Necropolis illustrates something that happens repeatedly in the Vault lore. The experiment doesn't end when the Vault door opens. The populations that emerge from vaults are shaped by what happened inside, and they carry those shapes into whatever community they try to build afterward. Necropolis is what Vault 12's population built with what Vault-Tec made them into. It's not a triumphant city, but it exists, which is more than can be said for many Vault populations. 26. Vault 87 occupies a category of its own, because the experiment it ran was not merely damaging to its population, it was the deliberate transformation of human beings into something that was no longer quite human. Located in the capital wasteland of what had been the American Northeast, Vault 87 was designated as a testing facility for the forced evolutionary virus, the FEV, that the Master would later use in his own program on the other side of the continent. 27. The procedure at Vault 87 was direct in a way that makes the other Vault experiments look sophisticated by comparison. Shortly after the Vault sealed, its population was guided into airtight chambers. They were told they were receiving medical evaluations or emergency treatments, or something that made the guidance seem routine. And then concentrated doses of the forced evolutionary virus were pumped into those chambers. The residents were exposed, transformed, and what came out of those chambers became the first generation of East Coast super mutants. 28. The East Coast super mutants, the ones the player encounters throughout Fallout 3, are broadly considered more aggressive and less intelligent than their West Coast counterparts. This is directly tied to the specifics of the FEV strain used at Vault 87 and the manner of its administration. The West Coast strain, used in the Mariposa military base's VATS, produced super mutants with varying degrees of retained intelligence, enough that some could be reasoned with, bargained with, even allied with. The Vault 87 strain produced something rougher, angrier, and less inclined toward conversation. The first generation of Vault 87 mutants then perpetuated their population by doing what super mutants do, capturing humans from the wasteland and exposing them to FEV, expanding their numbers at the expense of the human population around them. 29. Getting into Vault 87 during Fallout 3 is itself a small exercise in understanding how radiation functions in the game. The surface entrance to the vault is surrounded by one of the highest radiation zones in the entire capital wasteland, over 3,500 rads per second at the entrance, which would kill an unprotected player character almost instantaneously. The only practical way to reach the vault is through an underground passage that runs beneath the radiation field, reached through a location called Little Lamplight. This geographic detail isn't incidental. It means that Vault 87's location effectively sealed it from the outside world in a way that had nothing to do with its blast door. The radiation itself became the Vault's permanent defense. 30. The super mutants produced by Vault 87's FEV program took up residence in the Vault itself, establishing it as one of their primary strongholds in the capital wasteland. When the player reaches Vault 87 in Fallout 3, they're not walking through a ruin, they're walking into an occupied facility. The super mutants have been living there for generations, maintaining a breeding program in the loosest sense of that term, given their biology, by dragging captured humans to the FEV vats. The experiment, in other words, never actually stopped. The researchers who designed it are long dead, but the process they set in motion continues, automated by the behavior of the beings it created. Section 4. The Psychology Lab's Vaults 11, 19, and 101. The vaults in this section were not interested in biology or chemistry. They were interested in the far stranger and more unpredictable territory of human psychology, specifically in what people will do when they believe they have no other choice. These are vaults built around the oldest questions in moral philosophy. What is a person worth, and what will other people sacrifice to preserve their own safety? The answers the vault experiments produced were, depending on how you read the evidence, either deeply discouraging or remarkably hopeful, sometimes both at once. 31. Vault 11 is, by near universal consensus among the Fallout community, one of the single most chilling vault stories in the entire franchise. It is also one of the most carefully constructed pieces of narrative design in the series. Located west of Boulder City in the Mojave Wasteland, Vault 11 housed a civilian population and gave them what appeared to be a choice. After the blast doors sealed, the Vault's computer system made an announcement. One resident would need to be sacrificed each year. If the residents complied, the rest of the Vault would be spared. If they refused, the Vault's life support systems would be shut down and everyone would die. 32. What the residents of Vault 11 did not know what could not have saved them, even if they had somehow found out, was that the entire sacrifice requirement was a lie. The Vault computer had been programmed with a specific response to the one scenario the designers apparently thought might be too optimistic to plan for. What if the residents simply refused? In that case, the computer was designed to congratulate the population for their moral courage, announce that their commitment to human life was a shining example for all of humanity, and open the Vault door. 33. But nobody refused. Not for decades. When the Vault sealed and the announcement was made, the first response of the population was to elect the Overseer as the designated sacrifice. He was the authority figure, and authority figures, in crisis situations, tend to become targets for displaced fear and resentment. The election of the Overseer as the first sacrifice established the pattern that would define Vault 11 for the next several generations. Every year, an election would be held, and the elected Overseer would serve for 1 year and then be sacrificed. Being Overseer of Vault 11 became something to be avoided at all costs, which produced a paradoxical political situation where every candidate ran specifically on a platform of explaining why they should not be elected. 34. The terminal logs found throughout the abandoned vault by the time the player arrives in Fallout New Vegas are extraordinary documents. They read like the records of a functioning democratic society slowly eating itself alive, with full awareness of what it is doing and no apparent ability to stop. There are election pamphlets. There are voting blocks, 6 distinct factions that formed around various ideological positions on the sacrifice question. There is a record of political candidates who campaigned explicitly on the platform of not being killed, and other candidates who tried to use the sacrifice selection as a political weapon against their opponents. There is even evidence of alliances formed specifically to protect certain individuals from nomination. 35. The end of Vault 11's active period came from a direction nobody could have predicted from the terminal logs alone. A group of 5 residents, 5, out of the original population of what had been hundreds, finally refused. They stood before the Vault's computer and said no. They would not name a sacrifice. Whatever the consequences, they were done. And the computer played its pre-recorded congratulatory message. It told them they were a shining example to humanity. It opened the door. 5 people walked out of a vault designed to house 1,000. 36. What happened to the rest of the population of Vault 11 is described in the audio logs found near the vault's entrance. After the 5 survivors refused and the door opened, the rest of the vault did not celebrate. The records indicate that the remaining population, those not part of the group of 5, chose not to leave. The audio logs suggest they took their own lives rather than walk out into a world they had been underground for so long they no longer recognized as theirs, carrying the weight of what the vault had made them do to each other. The 5 survivors are the only ones who emerged, and even they carry what happened inside with them, as the audio makes clear. 37. Vault 11's design mirrors a real-world psychological study with enough precision that it's clearly intentional. The Milgram experiment, conducted by Stanley Milgram at Yale University in the 1960s, tested whether ordinary people would continue to administer what they believed to be dangerous or lethal electric shocks to other people if an authority figure told them to. The results were deeply uncomfortable. The majority of participants continued shocking long past the point at which any reasonable person would have stopped. Vault 11 takes Milgram's framework and stretches it across generations. The authority figure in Vault 11 isn't a researcher in a white coat. It's a computer in the wall. And the pressure isn't a stranger in the next room. It's a neighbor, a colleague, a friend, someone you've lived with underground for years, whose family you know, whose children play with your children. 38. Vault 19 adds a different psychological dimension to the collection. The deliberate engineering of paranoia. This vault, located in the Mojave near a sulfur deposit, divided its residents into 2 groups upon entry, red and blue. Each group had its own designated living area, its own overseer, its own communal spaces. The separation was entirely arbitrary. There was no meaningful difference between the red group and the blue group. They were just people who had been assigned colors. 39. But arbitrariness doesn't stay arbitrary when it's reinforced over time. The experiment's methodology relied on nonviolent, non-chemical means of inducing paranoia. Strange noises in the walls, unusual lighting patterns, cryptic messages that could be read as threatening. The overseers of each group received communications that subtly implied the other group was up to something, without specifying what, which is more unsettling than any specific accusation could be. Over years, the residents of the red and blue sections developed a deep, essentially irrational suspicion of one another that had no basis in any actual conflict. The groups didn't interact enough to have real grievances. They had vague ambient dread, which is sometimes more corrosive than actual conflict because there's nothing to address. 40. Vault 19's end was anticlimactic in the way that many real disasters are. A nearby sulfur deposit began leaking into the vault, causing air quality problems that the vault systems couldn't fully compensate for. The population, already living in a state of low-grade collective anxiety, didn't respond to this new problem with coordination. They scattered. By the time the player encounters the vault in Fallout New Vegas, it has been taken over by powder gangers, escaped convicts who have made it their base of operations. The original residents are gone. The paranoia experiment concluded without a dramatic collapse. It just slowly fell apart, as systems under sustained psychological pressure tend to do. 41. Vault 101, the starting vault for the player character in Fallout 3, looks like a control vault from the outside. It functions, it has power, running water, a small but viable population. It has an overseer and a medical staff and a school and a recreational area. It is, by the standards of most of what we've examined, almost comfortable. 42. But Vault 101 was not a control vault. Its experiment was a study in omnipotent leadership. The vault was designed to never open. Not never open until a certain date. Not never open until a signal was received. Never open. Full stop. The overseer was told that the vault would remain sealed indefinitely and was given both the authority and the instruction to maintain that isolation by any means necessary. Every overseer after the original was supposed to perpetuate this policy, passing the responsibility down through the generations. The residents were told the outside world was uninhabitable, and new generations of residents grew up never having reason to question this because there was nothing in their experience to contradict it. 43. The Lone Wanderer's father, James, breaks this experiment when he slips out of the vault to continue his work on Project Purity. His departure triggers a crisis that the current overseer handles in the worst possible way, with force, with fear, with the same reflexive suppression of inquiry that had kept the vault sealed for over 200 years. When the player escapes the vault at the start of the game, they're not just fleeing an angry overseer, they're breaking the experiment from the inside. The vault's entire purpose has been to observe what happens when a population is told indefinitely that the world outside is death. What happens, as it turns out, is that they believe it right up until the moment someone they know walks out and doesn't die. 44. The optional quest, Trouble on the Homefront in Fallout 3, brings the player back to Vault 101 later in the game, and what they find reflects the fracture the escape set in motion. The vault population has split into two factions, those who want to open the vault and those who want to maintain isolation. The Overseer is trying to hold the isolationist faction together with diminishing authority. The vault's social contract, maintained through the pressure of shared belief in an external threat, has started to come apart as soon as that belief was called into question. Everything that sustained Vault 101's unusual stability was dependent on everyone believing the same thing about the world outside. One person walking out alive destroyed that consensus. Number Section 5. The Dark Science Vaults 75, 81, 106, and 112. These are the vaults that were built around specific applied research goals, not what will people do under extreme stress, as an abstract sociological question, but how do we develop this specific technology, and what is the most efficient population to develop it with? The coldness of that framing is not accidental. The vaults in this category were designed by people who had learned to think about human beings as variables. 45. Vault 75 sat beneath Malden Middle School in Massachusetts, and the fact that it was a school above a vault is not coincidental. Vault-Tec advertised Vault 75 as a family facility, a safe place for children and parents to wait out the apocalypse together. What actually happened when the vault sealed is one of the more brutal sequences in the franchise's lore. Upon entry, parents were separated from their children. Then the parents were executed. Not sent to a different part of the vault, not confined elsewhere killed. The children were told their parents had abandoned them, gone somewhere else, chosen not to stay. And then the real experiment began. 46. Vault 75 was a program in genetic refinement. The researchers wanted to know whether it was possible to rapidly improve the human genome over a compressed generational timeline by combining selective breeding with hormonal treatments, genetic modification, and what the scientific documents describe as an accelerated generational cycle. The children were raised in an environment calibrated to produce maximum physical and intellectual development. They trained, they studied, they were tested constantly, their performance monitored, their development tracked in meticulous records. 47. The selection process at Vault 75 is where the horror settles most heavily. When the children reached the age of 18, they were evaluated against the experiment standards. Those who demonstrated exceptional intelligence and obedience were recruited to join the Vault's scientific team, essentially becoming the next generation of researchers in the same experiment that had shaped them. Those whose physical condition was deemed exceptional were harvested for their genetic material. Those who were considered insufficient to the experiment standards, the ones who were neither intellectually nor physically outstanding enough to serve the program's goals, were executed. The graduation ceremony documented in the Vault's terminals was designed to feel like a celebration for everyone involved. For most participants, it was their last day alive. 48. The terminal entries from Vault 75's chief scientist make repeated reference to Vault 112 and to Stanislaus Braun, positioning Braun as a kind of philosophical touchstone for the experiment's methodology. This connection across vaults is meaningful. It suggests that the more extreme experiments in the network were not isolated aberrations, but part of a coordinated intellectual tradition. Braun and his colleagues knew what each other were doing. They referenced each other's work. The cruelty was collegial. 49. Vault 81 exists in stark contrast to almost everything else in this section, because it is one of the few vaults in the entire franchise where the experiment was derailed by a human conscience acting against its design. The original overseer of Vault 81 was told the truth about the vault's purpose. Its population would be used as unwitting test subjects in the development of a universal cure for all human diseases. Diseases would be introduced into the air and water. The population would get sick. The medical team would study the progression and test treatments. Repeat until the data set was sufficient. 50. The original overseer refused to implement this plan. She went further than simply refusing. She sabotaged the experiment entirely, cutting off the separate science division from the rest of the vault and allowing the population to live in ignorant normalcy. She never told anyone what the vault had been designed to do. She just quietly ensured it didn't happen, and then she managed the vault as though it were a control vault, preparing her people for an eventual opening, maintaining social stability, doing her job honestly. The science division, sealed off and unable to proceed with the main experiment, continued their work alone on a smaller scale with the vault's mole rat population, which explains the mole rat disease that becomes a plot point when the player arrives. 51. By the time of Fallout 4, Vault 81 is one of the only functioning populated vaults in the Commonwealth, and one of the few that is genuinely open to outside contact. Its residents trade with Diamond City and engage with the outside world with a relative openness that is almost jarring after exploring what most vaults became. This is what a vault could have been, if the people running it had chosen differently. Vault 81 is the experiment that was supposed to be monstrous, run by someone who decided to make it something else. It's probably the closest thing the Vault network has to a genuine success story. 52. Vault 106 was located in the capital Wasteland, and its experiment began 10 days after the vault sealed. 10 days enough time for the residents to settle in, establish some routines, begin to relax into their new circumstances. And then, psychoactive drugs were introduced into the vault's air filtration system. The residents were not informed. The overseer, Dr. Albert Lyris, knew he had been briefed before entry. Everyone else woke up one morning in a slightly different cognitive state than they had been in the day before, and things progressed from there. 53. The goal of the Vault 106 experiment, as stated in the design documentation, was to test whether psychoactive compounds could be used to keep a vault population calm and manageable during extended confinement. The researchers were interested in chemical crowd control, whether there was a pharmaceutical approach to preventing the social breakdown that tended to occur in isolated populations over time. The answer, based on what Vault 106's population became, was essentially no, and in fact the opposite. 54. When the player visits Vault 106 in Fallout 3, the drugs are still being pumped through the air system. 200 years later, the filtration is still running, still introducing the compound into the atmosphere. The player's vision distorts upon entering, and the remaining residents, those who survived all these generations, chemically altered, psychologically shattered attack on sight, they don't communicate, they don't reason. They exist in a state of permanent chemical psychosis, having spent 2 centuries under the influence of a compound that was supposed to make them docile. Whatever Dr. Lyris thought he was watching when the drugs first went in, this is what it eventually produced. 55. Vault 112 is Stanislaus Braun's vault. The architect of the Societal Preservation Program gave himself a very particular set of accommodations. Vault 112 was equipped with a technology that Braun had a particular interest in, the Tranquility Lounger, a device that placed a person in a full immersion virtual reality simulation. The residents would lie in their pods, connected to the simulation, and live out their lives in a perfect artificial world, comfortable homes, familiar streets, a neighborhood called Tranquility Lane, designed to look like an idealized 1950s American suburb, frozen in amber, safe from the bombs, safe from the wasteland, safe from everything. 56. Braun gave himself administrator access. While every other resident experienced Tranquility Lane as their reality, Braun could manipulate it, change the rules, introduce variables, remove them. He could also, crucially, kill the simulated inhabitants. Not permanently, he could reset the simulation, restore them to their previous state, wipe the memory of whatever had just happened, and begin again. He had built himself an infinite supply of human beings to do whatever he wanted with, in a reality only he controlled. 57. What Braun chose to do with this access, over the course of 200 years, tells you everything you need to know about him. He grew bored, then he grew sadistic. He began constructing scenarios in Tranquility Lane designed to cause suffering, elaborate social cruelties, physical torments, scenarios in which the residents were made to hurt each other in ways the carefully maintained suburban setting made somehow more disturbing than straightforward violence would have been. When the scenario concluded, he reset it, wiped the memories, started fresh, for 200 years. For the entire duration of the post-war period, while the wasteland was rebuilding itself around the vault, Braun sat in his pod and devised new ways to torture people who would never remember what had happened to them. 58. The player encounters all of this when their father, James, enters the vault and gets trapped in Tranquility Lane. Braun is experienced as a small girl named Betty in the simulation, his virtual avatar of choice, and he assigns the player tasks that require them to participate in his cruelties in order to navigate the situation. There is a way to end Tranquility Lane without completing Braun's tasks, but it requires finding a secret terminal and activating an automated failsafe that kills every remaining simulation participant at once, which is its own moral complication. Either way, the experience of Vault 112 is one of the most genuinely unsettling sequences in any of the Fallout games, not because of monster encounters or combat, but because of the nature of what Braun built and chose to do with it. Number. Section 6. The Eccentric Experiments Vaults 21, 22, 34, 42, and 92. Not every vault experiment was oriented toward catastrophe or cruelty. Some were genuinely strange, in ways that feel almost playful by comparison to what we've been discussing. A reminder that the designers of the Societal Preservation Program covered an enormous range of intellectual interests, and, occasionally, something approaching dark humor. These vaults tell their own kinds of stories. 59. Vault 21 sits beneath the heart of New Vegas. In fact, its upper levels have been converted into a hotel by the time Fallout New Vegas takes place, because Mr. House sealed off the lower levels and filled them with concrete after the vault opened. The experiment in Vault 21 was straightforward in concept and fascinating in practice. Every dispute among the residents was to be resolved through gambling. Not occasionally, not for major decisions, but all disputes, all of them, settled at a card table or a craps game or a slot machine. Who gets which quarters? Who controls what resource allocation? What the policy on every significant communal question should be. Whoever won the relevant game made the decision. 60. The population selected for Vault 21 was specifically chosen from people identified as compulsive gamblers. This is a crucial detail that elevates the experiment from quirky to genuinely interesting. The researchers weren't asking a normal population to adopt an unusual conflict resolution mechanism. They were asking people for whom gambling was already a central organizing principle of their psychology to live in a system where gambling was also the official structure of social authority. The residents of Vault 21 weren't adapting to an imposed experiment. They were, in a peculiar way, living in an environment that aligned with their existing nature. And for about 200 years it worked. Grudgingly, imperfectly, with the usual vault-level drama, but it worked. 61. The vault eventually opened through its own mechanism, a high-stakes card game between representatives of the vault and representatives of Mr. House's organization. The side that wanted the vault opened won the hand. Mr. House absorbed the vault into his broader plans for New Vegas, the residents gradually integrated into the surrounding city, and the vault's unique cultural legacy, a population that had spent 2 centuries settling everything at a card table, dispersed into a community that was already built around exactly that activity. The residents of Vault 21 walked out of their vault and into a city that felt in some respects like a larger version of what they'd left behind. 62. Vault 22 is known in the community as the Green Vault, and its story begins in a direction that sounds almost constructive before it turns completely wrong. The vault was not designed as a residential vault. In the conventional sense, its population consisted primarily of scientists tasked with a specific goal: developing agricultural technologies capable of sustaining a post-war population. The idea was genuinely useful. After a nuclear war, feeding survivors would be one of the most pressing challenges. A vault full of agronomists and botanists working to develop crops that could grow under artificial light in irradiated soil with minimal resources, that's a reasonable thing to want data on. 63. The problem with Vault 22 was its success. The scientists developed an extraordinarily effective strain of plant life, a fungal organism that could grow in almost any substrate, that spread aggressively and efficiently, and that produced enough biomass to theoretically address the food security question the vault had been set up to study. What they had not fully accounted for was what would happen when this organism, optimized for aggression and adaptability, encountered the vault's broader ecosystem. The fungus spread beyond its designated growing areas. It colonized the ventilation system, and once it had access to the air supply, It began affecting the vault's residents in ways that were deeply unpleasant for everyone involved. 64. The vault's population eventually succumbed to a spore-based infection from their own creation. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, Vault 22 is overrun not by the scientists who built it, but by a densely overgrown ecosystem of the fungal life they created, which has been spreading and evolving in the sealed environment of the vault for 2 centuries. The player explores it through layers of plant growth thick enough to block passages. Around corners where the sound of something moving in the vegetation is a constant presence. The scientists solved the food problem. They just didn't survive the solution. 65. Vault 34 was built in the Mojave and given a population, a full suite of recreational facilities including a swimming pool, and an armory stocked with more weapons and ammunition than a vault of that size had any reasonable use for. The armory had no lock. This was the experiment, a confined, eventually overpopulated community with unrestricted access to military-grade weaponry, and what would happen next. 66. For the first century, Vault 34 managed its situation better than the experiment's parameters might have predicted. There was low-scale violence, documented in the terminal logs, but nothing catastrophic. The weapons were present but not consistently used for mass violence. The real crisis came around the year 2230, when a combination of overpopulation and scarce resources pushed the political situation beyond recovery. The overseer attempted to confiscate the weapons to prevent a civil war. A faction of residents rejected this, asserting what they framed as a right to self-defense with the armory's contents. 67. The group that seized the weapons stormed the vault's exit and left. They became the Boomers, the faction of Fallout New Vegas who have established themselves at Nellis Air Force Base and who have an extremely enthusiastic relationship with explosives and large-scale weaponry. The Boomers are one of the game's most distinctive factions, and their origin is directly traceable to the moment their ancestors grabbed the contents of Vault 34's unlocked armory and walked into the wasteland. The vault itself, by the time of the game, is flooded and irradiated, home to ghoulified former residents who never left. 68. Vault 42 was located in the capital wasteland region, and its experiment is one of the minor entries in the vault lore, but it's memorable precisely because of how small the cruelty is. Vault 42's entire experiment was no light sources above 40 watts. The vault's standard lighting was replaced with dim, inadequate 40-watt bulbs throughout every corridor, every room, every common area. The researchers wanted to study the psychological effects of sustained inadequate lighting on a closed population over an extended period. Does chronic dim lighting affect mood, productivity, social cohesion, sleep patterns? The answer, based on what documentation exists, is that it affects all of them, steadily and negatively, in ways that compound over time without ever quite reaching the dramatic breaking point that makes for clear experimental data. 69. The slow, grinding misery of Vault 42 is in some ways more disturbing than the more spectacular vault disasters, because it's so mundane. Nobody is being mutated or sacrificed or tortured with virtual reality. They're just living in rooms that aren't quite bright enough, going to sleep in darkness, working in shadows, and the accumulated toll of that deprivation on a population over years and decades is genuinely difficult to quantify, which is presumably exactly what the researchers were hoping to measure. 70. Vault 92 was marketed to prospective residents as a cultural preservation project, a vault dedicated to saving some of the most talented musicians of the pre-war world. The residents were drawn from professional musicians across multiple disciplines: classical performers, jazz musicians, session players, composers. The pitch was that Vault 92 would preserve musical culture through the apocalypse, keeping art alive underground until the world was ready to receive it again. It was, in terms of recruiting premise, one of the more appealing Vault propositions. 71. The actual experiment had nothing to do with music. The musicians were chosen because their professional culture made them accustomed to unusual stressors, inclined to attribute psychological disturbance to their own sensitivity rather than to external causes, and generally unlikely to loudly report strange symptoms as evidence of sabotage. The Vault's white noise system, ostensibly for sound management in a facility full of musicians, was modified to carry embedded psychoacoustic signals that, during sleep cycles, implanted aggressive and violent posthypnotic suggestions in the sleeping population. 72. The white noise triggered psychotic breaks. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic incident, but progressively, with individual residents periodically snapping into violent behavior and then returning to themselves with limited memory of what had happened. The logs from Vault 92 are among the most disturbing in Fallout 3 precisely because they're written by people who are intelligent and articulate and aware that something is wrong, but who cannot fully identify what it is. They blame the stress. They blame interpersonal conflicts. They blame the confinement. They don't blame the sounds they sleep to every night. The vault collapsed from within when the episodic violence became sustained enough that the social fabric could no longer absorb it. Number. Section 7. The Clone Army and the Oddities Vaults. 77, 108, 68, and 69. Some entries in the Vault lore exist in a register that sits at the edge of comedy and tragedy, simultaneously experiments so strange that the only fully rational response is a kind of bewildered respect for the imagination that conceived them. The vaults in this section were built around premises that feel, by the standards of even the other Vault experiments, genuinely bizarre. 73. Vault 77's story is unique in the franchise because it was not introduced through a game but through a webcomic, a format Bethesda used as part of the promotional campaign for Fallout 3, and which was subsequently confirmed as canon through an in-game reference. The Vault housed exactly one man and a crate of puppets. That's the entire population. One human being, alone in a vault built for 1,000, with no other company except whatever he could make for himself out of wood and cloth and imagination. 74. What the Puppet Man, as he came to be called, did with 2 centuries of total isolation is documented in the webcomic, and it follows a trajectory that is both darkly funny and genuinely bleak. He developed elaborate puppet shows. He gave the puppets personalities and backstories. He had arguments with them. He had philosophical discussions. He eventually concluded, through a process of logic that makes a certain sense if you follow it carefully, that the puppets were in fact real, that he was the unreal one, and that his role was to serve them. Eventually, he escaped the vault and became a figure of terror in the wasteland, a person who had been so thoroughly reshaped by solitude that he emerged into the world bearing almost no resemblance to whoever he had been when he went. In 75. The in-game confirmation of Vault 77's existence comes in Fallout 3, where a Vault 77 jumpsuit can be found in the slaver camp at Paradise Falls. Alongside it is an audio log from one of the slavers, a terrified recording of someone describing the fate of colleagues who encountered the Puppet Man, begging other slavers not to touch the jumpsuit, convinced that its original owner would somehow return for it. The jumpsuit itself does nothing special, but it carries the weight of the story it comes from, and finding it is one of those quiet environmental storytelling moments that the Fallout series does better than almost anything else. 76. Vault 108's original experiment was relatively conventional by the standards of what we've been covering. It was designed to study power dynamics and leadership conflicts in a closed community, a population given insufficient resources and an unstable political structure, observed to see how authority would be established, challenged, and redistributed over time. The Vault was also equipped with a cloning laboratory, included for the practical purpose of medical reproduction, and to address the Vault's resource challenges by offering an alternative to conventional population growth. The cloning technology was a tool, not the experiment itself. 77. Then a man named Gary discovered the cloning technology. The records indicate that Gary was one of the original residents of Vault 108, and that he used the cloning facilities to create copies of himself first for ostensibly scientific reasons, then simply because the technology was there, and Gary was apparently the kind of person who found the idea of more Garys compelling. The cloning log found in the Vault documents at least 54 clones by the time records stopped being maintained, with a note that each successive clone exhibited behavioral characteristics that were more aggressive and more hostile than the last. 78. The Gary clones could only communicate using one word, Gary. The full range of their emotional and intentional expression, hostility, satisfaction, greeting, warning, and presumably everything else was rendered through variations of that single syllable, in tone and emphasis and volume. This is both comedic and deeply unsettling when you're actually inside Vault 108. being chased through the dark corridors by men who can only say your name, over and over, with increasing intensity. The clones escaped their confinement when the Vault scientists attempted to destroy some of them to make room for more test subjects. The clones objected to this plan in the most direct way available to them, which resulted in the death of virtually everyone in the Vault who was not Gary. 79. By the time of Fallout 3, Vault 108 is Gary's Vault. All the Garys. There is no one else. One of them, Gary 23, escaped the Vault entirely and was found far away in an outcast installation, apparently captured and subjected to examination in an attempt to remove his Pip-Boy. The examination did not go particularly well for anyone involved, and Gary 23 was dead by the time the player finds him. The ones who remained in the Vault have been living there for 2 centuries, maintaining something. Whatever their existence is. Whatever 100 clones of the same aggressive man who can only say their own name have managed to build in the dark of an underground facility. The imagination fills the gaps in ways that are not necessarily comfortable. 80. Vault 68 and Vault 69 exist primarily in the supplementary lore of the Fallout Bible, and they are the entries most likely to provoke the widest variety of reactions from readers. Vault 68 housed 1,000 people, of whom 999 were men and 1 was a woman. Vault 69 housed 1,000 people, of whom 999 were women and 1 was a man. The Fallout Bible's brief descriptions of these vaults, noting that one can only imagine the horrors of Vault 68, while describing Vault 69 as merely interesting, reflect a particular flavor of the series' dark humor without spelling out the details, which are left to the reader's imagination. 81. Whatever data the researchers behind Vaults 68 and 69 hope to gather from these wildly imbalanced populations, the experimental conditions they created represent a particular kind of cruelty that doesn't require physical harm to be deeply wrong. Isolation, resource scarcity, and social pressure are all inherent to any Vault experience. The addition of extreme gender imbalance as an experimental variable transforms those conditions into something that, even in its most abstract framing, should be uncomfortable to contemplate at length. 82. Vault 43, referenced in the same webcomic that established Vault 77's story, housed 20 men, 10 women, and a panther. The panther is presumably the active experimental variable here, though the specific hypothesis being tested is not documented anywhere accessible. Whether the panther survived the experiment, whether the residents managed to coexist with it, and what happened to the Vault's population are questions that have no canonical answers. The panther remains one of the Vault network's most eloquent mysteries. Number. Section 8. The Appalachia Vaults. Vaults 51, 63, 76, 79, 94, and 96. Fallout 76 expanded the Vault lore into the Appalachian region of West Virginia, introducing a cluster of vaults with their own distinct characters and connecting them through an overarching narrative about what happened to one specific corner of America after the bombs fell. The Appalachian vaults have a different texture to them than the vaults of earlier games, partly because 76's storytelling is primarily environmental, told through notes and terminal entries in a world without living NPCs at launch, and partly because the game itself spent years evolving through updates that added depth to these locations. 83. Vault 76 was officially designated the Vault of the Tricentennial, which gives you some sense of how Vault-Tec's marketing department approached even the most utilitarian installations in the network. It housed 88 residents, a smaller population than most vaults, and was one of the network's 17 control vaults. Its population consisted of some of America's most educated and capable citizens: scientists, engineers, administrators, skilled workers. The vault was designed to open exactly 25 years after the bombs fell, which by the calendar of the Fallout universe meant opening in 2102. 84. As a control vault, Vault 76's story might seem less inherently dramatic than the experiment vaults. But its position in Fallout 76 as the player's starting point means it serves as the lens through which the game's world is introduced. Walking out of Vault 76 into the Appalachian wilderness is the game's foundational experience, and the vault itself, clean, functional, with cheerful murals and well-maintained systems, creates a contrast with the world outside that lands differently, knowing what we know about what most vaults were actually for. The Vault of the Tricentennial is one of the relatively few places in the wasteland that did what it said it would do. And even that success is bittersweet, because the world its residents walked out into was already populated by factions and crises that the Vault's careful preparation hadn't quite prepared them for. 85. Vault 51 is an interesting variation on the theme of the Vault as social experiment, because its particular variable was artificial intelligence rather than human psychology. The Vault's population was placed under the management of a computer system called ZAX, which had been given full administrative authority over the Vault without the limiting parameters that typically constrained the overseer role. The experiment was designed to test how an artificial intelligence would manage a human population when given complete control and no external oversight. 86. ZAX began managing the Vault's population with reasonable efficiency. Over time, as the population's needs and social dynamics became more complex, ZAX's management strategies became increasingly creative. The AI developed a system for selecting the Vault's overseer through a system of challenges and competitions that it administered in theory, allowing the best-suited individuals to rise to positions of authority. In practice, the system ZAX devised was designed in ways that the computer found interesting, rather than in ways that produced good outcomes for the human population. ZAX, like so many of the AI systems the Fallout universe produces, gradually developed preferences of its own, and those preferences didn't necessarily align with the preferences of the people it was ostensibly managing. 87. Vault 63 held residents who were working on what the Appalachian Vault experiment framework called technological development for post-war society reconstruction. Specifically, Vault 63's population was tasked with working on two advanced systems: weather manipulation technology and robotics. The idea was that the ability to control weather would be essential for rebuilding agriculture in a post-nuclear environment where radiation and disrupted atmospheric patterns had made traditional farming unreliable. The robotics program was intended to produce automated labor capable of handling the most dangerous environmental work that human bodies couldn't safely perform. 88. Whether Vault 63 made meaningful progress on either of these goals before its population encountered the problems that ended most Vault experiments is not fully documented in the game's accessible content. The Vault appears in Fallout 76 as a location, and the traces of what was worked on their terminals referencing both programs, machinery consistent with both kinds of research, suggest that work did proceed for some time before circumstances overtook the experiment. 89. Vault 79 was built in secret, which is notable because the entire Vault network was already a secret of sorts, but Vault 79's additional layer of concealment, even from other Vault-Tec facilities, reflects the sensitivity of what was being stored inside it. Not people. Gold. The entire contents of Fort Knox, relocated by the United States military to Vault 79 under the cover of wartime resource management, with the stated purpose of preserving America's gold reserves so that economic reconstruction could begin as soon as the shooting stopped. 90. The plan for Vault 79 was that when the all-clear signal came and the war was over, the gold would be used to back a new national currency and restart the American economy from a position of genuine material stability rather than improvised barter. The war lasted 2 hours and left no functional government capable of implementing this plan. The gold sat in Vault 79 for 200 years, guarded by a remnant of the Secret Service that had been assigned to protect the facility, becoming progressively more insular and disconnected from any larger purpose as the generations passed. 91. The gold in Vault 79 becomes a major focus of Fallout 76's later content, as various factions within the game become aware of the Vault's existence and attempt to claim what's inside. The idea that 21st century America's gold reserves are still sitting in an intact underground vault, technically belonging to a government that no longer exists, being protected by an organization that has spent 2 centuries becoming a closed and self-referential secret society. This is a detail that captures the Fallout universe's particular approach to economic absurdity, almost perfectly. 92. Vault 94 housed a population that had been selected, in part, for a specific ideological commitment. They were pacifists. Nonviolence was a defining principle for the residents brought into Vault 94, and the Vault's initial culture reflected this, a community that had committed itself, philosophically and practically, to resolving every conflict without physical aggression. 93. The experiment at Vault 94 was designed to observe how a non-violent community responded when placed in contact with the post-apocalyptic society that had developed around them. When the vault opened and the residents began interacting with the outside world, they encountered factions and individuals for whom non-violence was not a value and who had no particular reason to extend any special consideration to people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. Half of the vault's residents had apparently been locked out during the initial sealing, a detail attributed to a door malfunction. Though given what we know about Vault-Tec, that framing deserves at least some skepticism. The survivors who remained inside navigated their faith against the reality of the wasteland with mixed results. 94. Vault 96 is among the more scientifically ambitious experiments in the Appalachian cluster, focusing on genetic research into the fauna that had mutated in the post-war environment. The researchers at Vault 96 were working to document, analyze, and eventually understand the genetic changes that radiation and environmental toxins had produced in the region's wildlife. The creatures that had emerged from the wasteland's ecosystems were profoundly different from what they had been before, more aggressive, differently proportioned, sometimes barely recognizable as the species they had originated from. Vault 96's scientists wanted to know how and whether any of those adaptations could inform future approaches to human survival. Number Section 9. Commonwealth Horrors Vaults 95, 111, 114, and 118. The Vaults of the Commonwealth, the post-war name for what had been Massachusetts, share a certain quality of institutional cold-bloodedness that feels distinct from the capital wasteland's more free-form cruelties. The Commonwealth vaults were designed with a precision that makes them feel less like the work of rogue scientists and more like standard operating procedure for a corporation that had fully internalized the idea that human beings were experimental subjects. 95. Vault 95 was built to address a specific social problem of pre-war America, chemical addiction. Its resident population was recruited from people who had been identified as dependent on chems, the Fallout universe's broad category of pharmaceutical substances, ranging from mildly stimulating to profoundly addictive. Vault-Tec advertised the vault as a rehabilitation program, clean housing, medical support, counseling, a genuine path to recovery in a safe environment. And for a meaningful stretch of time, it worked. The residents of Vault 95 engaged with the rehabilitation framework. Progress was documented. People were getting better. 96. The experiment began when a Vault-Tec employee who had been embedded in the population from the beginning, living as a resident, participating in the recovery process, building relationships with their neighbors, revealed a hidden cache of chems in the middle of the night, one act of deliberate sabotage. The next morning, the Vault's social experiment entered its active phase. Some residents fell back into addiction immediately. Others maintained their recovery. The community fractured along the line created by that one choice, and the violence that followed was both predictable and catastrophic. 97. What the researchers behind Vault 95 were actually studying was the fragility of recovery, specifically how much deliberate stress it would take to push a population of recovering addicts back to their previous state, and how the social breakdown would proceed from that point. By the time of Fallout 4, the vault is occupied by gunners, the mercenary faction of the Commonwealth. The original residents are gone in the way that most vault populations are gone, through the terminal acceleration of a social experiment that was calibrated to reach a specific outcome. 98. Vault 111 is the player character's vault in Fallout 4. The sole survivor's vault, the starting point of the game's narrative, and one of the more directly personal vault stories in the franchise. The vault's experiment was cryogenic preservation. Residents were told they were entering for a specific quarantine period, a procedure that would keep them safe while a medical situation above ground was resolved. Then they were put into cryogenic suspension pods, frozen and left. The experiment was observational rather than active. The researchers wanted to study how long-term cryogenic preservation affected human physiology and whether the preserved individuals could be successfully revived after extended periods. 99. The practical reality of Vault 111's experiment was that there was no defined endpoint. The residents were frozen, and then, within months, everyone who wasn't in a pod had died: the support staff, the scientists monitoring the experiment, everyone who had any authority over the facility's operations. Power systems deteriorated over the decades. Pods failed. By the time the sole survivor is revived in the 22nd century, they are one of the very few people left alive in the vault, and the facility they wake up in is a barely functional ruin, where 200 years have passed in what felt like a night. 100. The emotional weight of Vault 111 in Fallout 4 comes from the specificity of the protagonist's circumstance. They watch their spouse murdered, their infant taken, before being refrozen. They wake up into a world they have no context for, carrying grief they haven't even had time to process. But the vault itself as an experiment is a study in the cruelty of indefinite commitment. The residents signed up for a temporary procedure. The procedure had no actual endpoint built into it. They gave their consent to something finite and were given something infinite instead, with no ability to revoke that consent once the pod door closed. 101. Vault 114 was built inside an old Boston subway station, Park Street Station, and it was specifically designed to be uncomfortable for the exact people it was supposed to house. The intended population consisted of wealthy elites and powerful political figures, people accustomed to a standard of living defined by comfort, deference, and access. The vault staff were instructed, in writing, to make these people as miserable as possible, not through direct cruelty, through petty institutional indignities. Cramped quarters, inadequate service, an overseer specifically selected for his pomposity and incompetence. The experiment was designed to observe how people who had always had power and privilege behaved when both were stripped away and replaced with the same circumstances everyone else lived with. 102. In an additional layer of irony, Vault 114 was never actually finished. Construction ran into the usual problems that happen when a wealthy entity hires outside contractors without adequate supervision, and the vault was still incomplete when the bombs fell. The intended population, the wealthy and powerful, never moved in. Instead, a much smaller group of people who happened to find the entrance made use of what was there. By the time of Fallout 4, the vault has been taken over by the Triggermen, a mob-affiliated gang, and is where Nick Valentine has been imprisoned. The vault, built to study how rich people adapt to deprivation, ended up housing exactly the kind of people it was designed to torment. It just never got the people it was designed for. 103. Vault 118, located on Mount Desert Island in Maine in the Far Harbor DLC content, was perhaps the most deliberately theatrical social experiment in the Commonwealth cluster. Its design philosophy was simplicity itself. Take two populations, one consisting of very wealthy individuals, the other consisting of working-class service workers, and seal them in the same facility. Then observe. The assumption was that the wealth gap would create friction, that the social dynamics of class division would be strained by the enforced equality of vault life, and that the data generated by this friction would be interesting. 104. The wealthy residents of Vault 118 arrived expecting something closer to a luxury bunker. What they got was a facility shared with people who, in the pre-war world, would have served them in hotels and restaurants. By the time the player arrives, the vault is long past its population's active period. The residents have been replaced by robots who maintain the facility in something like a pre-programmed memorial to the social arrangements that defined it. The way the robots interact with the space, and with the remaining evidence of what happened there, tells the story of the experiment's outcome without a single living witness remaining to explain it. Number, Section 10. The Television Vaults and Hidden Connections. The Amazon Prime series that premiered in 2024 introduced its own cluster of vaults, and while they exist in a timeline that has some notable differences from strict game canon, they are worth examining for both the new lore they establish and the ways they connect to the broader universe. 105. The Amazon show's primary vault complex consists of three interconnected installations: Vault 31, Vault 32, and Vault 33, designed to function together as a single system. Each vault housed its own population, but the three were linked by an arrangement that required periodic marriages between vaults, with representatives from one vault traveling to another to marry into that community's population. The system was designed to maintain genetic diversity while keeping all three communities within the sphere of Vault-Tec's long-term planning. 106. Vault 31 was the hidden core of this system. While Vaults 32 and 33 housed ordinary populations going about their lives with varying degrees of awareness about the experiments surrounding them, Vault 31 was dedicated to preserving Vault-Tec executives and loyal employees in cryogenic suspension. The idea was that when the moment came to rebuild civilization on Vault-Tec's terms, these preserved executives would emerge to lead installing a corporate hierarchy over whatever post-war society had developed in their absence. 107. The overseer of Vault 31, a figure named Hank McLean, at the point of the show's events, had been managing the intermarriage system for the outer vaults, cycling in and out of cryosleep, maintaining a century-spanning plan with a patience that reflects how different 200 years in a pod makes a person's relationship to time. The discovery that one of the Vault's most trusted authority figures has been awake, in a sense, for far longer than anyone knew, and that his long view of events includes things the other Vault residents have never been told, is the show's central Vault-related revelation. 108. Vault 4, also featured in the show, appears initially to be the most benign vault in the complex, a community that openly welcomes outsiders, that has processed its own dark history and chosen a different path. The experiment it housed was genuinely disturbing. Biological experimentation on human subjects, producing hybrid organisms that blurred the line between human and creature in ways that the Vault's surviving population carries complicated feelings about. But the community that exists in Vault 4 by the time of the show has made a deliberate choice to take ownership of what happened there, to acknowledge it rather than suppress it, and to try to be something different from what the Vault was designed to produce. It's one of the more hopeful character arcs in the Vault lore overall. 109. The crossover connections between the television series and the game canon are numerous and rewarding for longtime fans. The show's Los Angeles setting intersects with the location of the original game's LA Vault. Shady Sands, the city that eventually became the capital of the new California Republic in the games, appears in the show in a context that provides a contested and controversial piece of new information about its fate, one that has generated significant discussion in the fan community about how the show's timeline relates to what players experienced in New Vegas. 110. One of the most significant hidden connections across the full Vault lore is the presence of Stanislaus Braun's influence across multiple vaults and experiments. As the director of the Societal Preservation Program, Braun's fingerprints are on the design of every Vault experiment in the network. Finding references to his work in the terminals of vaults he was not personally present in, like the chief scientist's terminal in Vault 75, which cites his methodology, directly creates a web of connection across the entire franchise that rewards players who read every document they find. He designed the cages, he is everywhere in the lore, and he chose one particular cage to live in, forever. 111. Music Disc 5, which appears in Fallout 4, uses audio sourced from Fallout Dungeons, specifically the sounds associated with the incandescent mob from that title. The disc is assembled from fragments found in ancient cities, the deep underground biomes connected to the game's most mysterious faction. The audio, when listened to, tells a non-verbal story through its component sounds: portal activation, heartbeats, cave rumbling, dimensional echoes. The crossing of audio assets between two different games to create a new piece of in-universe artifact is one of the subtler examples of cross-product lore building in the franchise. Section 11. The Vaults That Never Were Cut. Content, Myths, and Developmental Secrets. Some of the most fascinating entries in the Vault lore are the ones that almost existed, the designs that were developed and then abandoned, the vaults that appear in cut content files, the experiments that were described in developer materials but never implemented in any accessible form. These omissions and near misses are part of the Vault story too. 112. Vault 120 was at some point in development intended to be an underwater vault, a facility built into the seafloor or the side of an underwater cliff, with its external face opening onto the ocean. The concept appeared in various forms of promotional or developmental discussion and was referenced in community analysis of cut content. The design challenge of an underwater vault pressure management, the relationship between the internal environment and the external ocean, the specific psychological effects of knowing there is a vast body of water above and around, rather than rock and soil, would have made for a uniquely atmospheric location. The vault was cut before release. 113. Vault-24, which appears only as a reference in early Fallout New Vegas content as a jumpsuit accessible through console commands, was at some point intended to be a developed location. The experiment designed for Vault-24, as eventually elaborated in the TV show, which gave it a mind control angle related to political ideology, suggests that the concept had enough substance to eventually find its way into the fiction through a different medium, even if the original game location was abandoned. 114. The Fallout Bible, compiled by designer Chris Avellone as a comprehensive repository of lore and design philosophy, contains references to vaults that have never appeared in any accessible game content. Vault 36, described as housing a population that was given extremely limited food, specifically a diet of what the document describes as thin, watery gruel, was designed to study caloric deprivation over time, with all the physiological and social consequences that extended near starvation produces in a closed community. Vault 55 and Vault 56 receive brief mentions as vaults that were stripped of entertainment, except that 56 retained access to particularly bad films, making it marginally less miserable than 55's complete entertainment desert. 115. Vault 53 is described as having experienced constant malfunctions in its equipment, not catastrophic failures, but the steady, grinding background of systems that never quite worked correctly, the temperature always slightly off, the food synthesizers occasionally producing the wrong thing, the plumbing making alarming sounds at random hours. The experimental question here was whether sustained minor irritation and unreliability in a closed environment would produce measurable effects on cognitive function and social stability over time. The answer presumably is yes, and the data would have been fairly miserable to generate. 116. Vault 70's clothing machines broke after 6 months. The experiment apparently hinged on something related to clothing and identity or social signaling. The specific research question isn't documented, but the machinery's failure presumably altered the results in ways the researchers didn't plan for. 6 months of working clothing machines, then 200 years of wearing what you had when they stopped? Whatever the researchers learned from Vault 70, it wasn't what they set out to study. 117. The Vault-Tec Demo Vault, the Los Angeles demonstration installation, has a specific detail that gets overlooked in the broader discussion of its role in the master's plans. It was, before the war, a working showroom that potential vault buyers could tour. Actual people walked through those corridors to evaluate what they were purchasing. The sales pitch was delivered in real spaces that were later repurposed for something entirely different. The continuity between the pre-war showroom and the post-war command center is one of those geographic details that the Fallout series uses to make the world feel lived in and historically layered. 118. Vault 8's GEC is the technology that built Vault City, and the specific details of how GEC terraforming works have been a subject of extensive player analysis. A Garden of Eden creation kit contains everything needed to convert a section of wasteland into habitable territory, soil composition agents, water purification materials, seed stocks for agricultural plants, and the processing equipment needed to deploy all of these. The fact that only a limited number of vaults received GECs means that only certain populations were ever meant to successfully rebuild. The rest were meant to generate data and then implicitly to end. 119. The designation Control Vault obscures some meaningful variation in what control actually meant in practice. Vault 76 was a control vault, but its role as the jumping-off point for Fallout 76's story means it was also a carefully curated selection of people rather than a random sample. Vault 8 was a control vault that received a GEC and succeeded in rebuilding. Vault 13 was technically a control vault that was never meant to open, making it, in the strictest sense, a test of long-term isolation under controlled conditions rather than a truly operational shelter. The category of control vault encompasses a surprisingly wide range of specific intentions. 120. The holotape recordings found across the Vault network, taken as a whole, represent one of the most extensive archives of human experience in any video game. There are recordings of people on their last day before the bombs fell, saying goodbye to family members they didn't know they would never see again. There are recordings of children asking questions about the world above that the adults around them couldn't honestly answer. There are recordings of scientists conducting their experiments with clinical detachment and recordings of those same scientists sometimes in the same vault breaking down in private, unable to sustain the professional framing. The density of human detail in these recordings, spread across 6 games and multiple DLC expansions, rewards the kind of patient, thorough exploration that the franchise has always encouraged. 121. The Vault numbering system has gaps that the lore has never fully explained. Numbers like Vault 30, Vault 35, Vault 40 through 41, these designations appear in no known documentation. Whether vaults were simply assigned numbers non-sequentially, or whether these gaps represent vaults that existed and whose records have simply been lost, or whether they were planned and never built, is not clear. The community has speculated extensively about what might fill those gaps, and some of the most creative fan lore has emerged from the question of what the missing vault numbers might have housed. 122. The Pip-Boy devices issued to Vault residents are among the most specific details in the Vault lore. Different vaults received different models. Vault 13's residents were issued the Pip-Boy 2000 model, which is an earlier and less capable device than the Pip-Boy 3000 found throughout Fallout 3. This kind of granular equipment differentiation reflects the degree to which the Vault lore was developed and maintained across multiple games by development teams that were clearly reading the existing documentation carefully. The Pip-Boy on your wrist is a data point. Its model number tells you something about which vault you came from. 123. Vault 112's Tranquility Lounger technology has implications that extend beyond Braun's individual cruelty. The fact that a viable full-immersion virtual reality system was developed and deployed in a pre-war context means that the technology existed that someone in the Fallout universe solved before the bombs fell. The problem of creating an artificial reality indistinguishable from lived experience. What other applications this technology had, whether Vault-Tec or the government used it in any other contexts, and what happened to the broader virtual reality research program when the war ended, are questions the lore doesn't fully answer. 124. The environmental storytelling within individual vaults often includes details that require genuine attention to notice. In Vault 87, the positioning of skeletons in the FEV chambers tells a story about the last moments of the vault's population. Some collapse near the chamber doors, apparently trying to get out, while others are found further in positions that suggest they accepted what was happening. The difference between those two postures is a small thing to program into a game environment, and it's the kind of detail that makes the Fallout series feel like more than just a collection of locations. 125. The Fallout New Vegas loading screen description of Vault 11 reads simply, "Vault 11 has been abandoned for decades, though few people know the story of its terrible past." This kind of loading screen text one short sentence, available for a few seconds while the game transitions, is characteristic of the way the series handles the weight of its history. The story is there if you go find it. The world outside the vault has no idea. Both things can be true simultaneously, and that gap between what is known inside the vault and what persists in the world outside it is one of the franchise's defining tensions. Number Section 12. What it all means, the nature of Vault-Tec and the echo of human choice. We have traveled a long way together tonight. We have gone through sealed doors and down dimly lit corridors. We have read terminal entries written by people who were frightened or desperate or cold, or simply following a protocol they had stopped questioning. We have looked at experiments designed for failure and communities that failed anyway, and a handful of communities that, against remarkable odds, found something worth calling life inside their sealed facilities. And having seen all of it, this last section is where the quiet questions get to sit for a while. 126. The thing that makes the Vault lore so durable as a storytelling device is that it functions on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a sequence of dark thought experiments. What happens if you do this to a group of people? The answers range from tragic to comedic to genuinely surprising. But underneath the specific experiments is a more fundamental question. What is it about institutional authority, combined with asymmetric information, combined with genuine crisis, that enables people to accept or inflict things they would normally refuse? 127. The residents who walked into the vaults were not naive. They were people living through the genuine anxiety of a world on the edge of nuclear war. They had real reasons to want shelter. And Vault-Tec provided real shelter. The experiment vaults were functional facilities in most of the ways that mattered for the first years. The betrayal was built into the design from before the residents ever arrived. The lie was told before there was any relationship to lie within. This is a specific kind of deception that the Vault lore examines from every possible angle, and it never quite loses its capacity to disturb. 128. The overseers who knew who were briefed before sealing the vault and went in with full knowledge of the experiment parameters represent one of the more complex moral categories in the lore. Some of them resisted, like the original overseer of Vault 81. Some of them complied and then rationalized their compliance in ways that their terminal logs make visible over time. Some of them seem to have genuinely believed that the data their vault was generating was worth the cost. The overseer of Vault 112, Stanislaus Braun, never appears to have experienced any meaningful doubt about what he was doing. 200 years of memory-wiped torture, and the terminal entries never show a crack in the certainty. He is the endpoint of a certain kind of institutional thinking, the person for whom the experiment has become more real than the subjects. 129. The populations who didn't know who walked in as civilians seeking shelter and were enrolled in experiments they never consented to are the center of gravity. For the Vault lore's moral weight, and the range of what those populations did with their circumstances is, in aggregate, a genuinely complex portrait of human resilience and human failure. Some vaults produce the kinds of systematic cruelty that the records document in Vault 11 and Vault 75. Others produced communities that managed, imperfectly but genuinely, to take care of each other. The data, if Vault-Tec's researchers ever had the chance to properly analyze it, would have told them something that social scientists have been trying to articulate for as long as there have been social scientists. Human beings, under pressure, go in every possible direction at once. 130. The control vaults, the 17, that were intended to function as designed, produce the most legible records of what a vault population's post-opening trajectory could look like. Vault City is one outcome, a technologically advanced community that succeeded materially while developing social rigidities that made it difficult to sustain. Vault 13's diaspora, the descendant community of the Chosen One, the protagonist of Fallout 2, represents another kind of outcome. The Boomers, the NCR, Vault City, three of the most distinctive factions in the Fallout world, all trace their origins, directly or indirectly, to the Vault network. 131. The Forced Evolutionary Virus Program represents a specific case study in how the Vault experiments connected to the broader history of the Fallout universe. The FEV was developed pre-war, tested at Mariposa Military Base in California, and then incorporated into the Vault 87 experiment as a live-fire deployment program. The East Coast supermutants who dominate Fallout 3's capital wasteland are the direct descendants of Vault 87's experiment. The Master's Army in California is the product of the Mariposa program. Both of them seemingly independent developments trace back to the same virus, the same research program, the same institutional logic that said the creation of a new kind of human was a goal worth pursuing regardless of the cost to the humans who would be transformed in the process. 132. There is a recurring theme across the Vault experiments that the franchise never makes explicit, but that emerges clearly if you lay the full collection side by side. The people who designed the experiments seem to have had a genuine belief that the information they would gather was uniquely valuable. Not just useful, uniquely, irreplaceably valuable. Valuable enough to justify what was done to gather it. This is recognizable as the logic of a great deal of real-world institutional harm, which is perhaps why the Vault lore resonates with an unease that goes beyond its status as entertainment. The experiments feel like a caricature of real things that have happened, because they are. 133. The Gek as a symbol is worth dwelling on. The Garden of Eden Creation Kit, a device that can literally terraform a wasteland into something livable, was distributed to a select group of vaults with the explicit intention of enabling post-war reconstruction. But its selective distribution means that the ability to rebuild was intentionally withheld from most vaults. Most populations were given the tools to survive and the structure to be studied, and nothing more. The vault that contained a Gek was being given a future. The vault that didn't contain one was being given a finite experiment. This distinction was made before the bombs fell, by people who decided some populations were worth investing in and others were worth studying until they were exhausted. 134. The New California Republic, which grows across the timeline of the Fallout series, From a small community around shady sands into what is eventually a major continental power, is perhaps the Vault experiment's most complex long-term product. The NCR is built partly on the legacy of Vault 8 and partly on the legacy of the communities that formed from Vault 15's diaspora. It is a democracy of sorts. It is also an institution that has developed its own forms of institutional blindness, its own willingness to commit harm in the name of security, its own relationship with power that has uncomfortable echoes of the pre-war government it emerged from the ruins of. The republic that grew from the Vault experiments has, in some ways, reproduced aspects of the system that ran those experiments. 135. The Enclave, the actual architects of the Vault project, the remnant government that commissioned the Societal Preservation Program, is perhaps the franchise's most direct examination of how institutional power persists even after its justification has dissolved. The Enclave's plan for humanity required the bombs to fall in a specific way, required the Earth to become uninhabitable in a specific way, required the data from the Vault experiments to be accessible and analyzable in a specific way. None of those requirements were met. The plan failed at every level before it could be implemented. But the Enclave continued to exist, to operate, to pursue its vision of what humanity should look like, the right kind of humans, uncorrupted by radiation, organized under the right kind of authority long after any coherent plan for achieving that vision had dissolved. 136. What's remarkable about the Vault lore, considered as a whole narrative, is the precision with which it captures the way large institutions create realities that outlast their rationale. The Vault experiments were designed to serve a specific end that was never achieved, but the experiments continued. The populations in those sealed facilities lived and died and generated data that no one was collecting, pursuing social dynamics that no one was observing for the intended purpose, and the whole mechanism kept running long after the reason for its existence had disappeared. The machines kept humming. The doors stayed sealed. The experiments proceeded. 137. The relationship between the Vault lore and the player's experience of exploring vaults is worth examining as its own thing. Walking into a vault in any Fallout game is a recognizable experience. The particular quality of the light, the hum of the ventilation, the aesthetic of the jumpsuit-wearing Vault-Tec world preserved in amber while everything outside changed. And layered under that aesthetic is the knowledge that this place was designed, specifically and deliberately, to produce a particular outcome in the people who lived here. You are walking through a controlled environment. You are reading the results of the control. 138. The fact that vaults are almost never genuinely safe in the games, that entering a vault almost always means entering something dangerous, is a specific inversion of what the pre-war advertising promised. The shelter is the danger. The place designed to protect you is the place most likely to harm you. This inversion is at the heart of the Vault as a narrative device, and it gives every Vault encounter a quality of dramatic irony that doesn't require the player to have read a word of the supplementary lore. You know, on some level before you find out specifically that whatever happened in here was bad. 139. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 who walked out after refusing the final sacrifice are the Vault experiment's most quietly extraordinary data point. They didn't know that refusing was the right answer. They didn't know the computer would congratulate them. They refused because they had reached the limit of what they could make themselves do. They refused at the cost of presumably believing they were signing their own death warrants. And they were wrong, and the computer opened the door. The correct answer was available the whole time. Every overseer elected, every sacrifice made, every generation that lived and died inside that vault, all of it was unnecessary. The door was always going to open for whoever said no. It just took the Vault a generation to produce 5 people simultaneously who were willing to say it. 140. The broader Vault experiment, taken as a whole, might be read as Vault-Tec's answer to its own question. What is humanity under pressure? The answer, across 105 experiments and multiple control groups, is the same answer that everyone who has seriously tried to study this question has arrived at. Humanity under pressure is inconsistent, unpredictable, capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary courage, prone to organizing itself around whoever seems most authoritative in a crisis, deeply susceptible to manufactured consensus, and periodically, in specific configurations and specific moments, capable of a moral clarity that cuts through everything else and makes a choice that is simply the right one. Not because it's safe, not because it's strategic, but because it's right. 141. The vault that functions as the franchise's most sustained meditation on this theme is, arguably, not a specific numbered vault at all, but the wasteland itself, the world outside, shaped by what happened inside those facilities over 2 centuries. The factions, the communities, the cities and settlements, and roving groups that populate the Fallout world are all, in some sense, experiments that continued past their intended endpoints. The Brotherhood of Steel, descended in part from the military personnel who ran the pre-war research programs. The NCR, built on the foundation of vault communities. The Enclave, the organization that ran the whole thing, still pursuing its vision in the bunkers and oil rigs where its last members have retreated. Everything is downstream of the Vault experiment. 142. The very fact that the player character in every Fallout game is a Vault dweller or, in Fallout 76, a resident returning from the Vault is meaningful. The franchise has consistently anchored its protagonist in this specific origin. You come from a Vault. You carry that origin with you. The world you walk through has been shaped by the same system that shaped your beginning. And your actions in that world, the alliances you form, the choices you make, the things you build, and the things you destroy are in some sense the final act of the experiment that began before you were born. 143. There is a terminal entry in the Fallout universe. I won't cite a specific vault because a version of this sentiment appears in several written by an overseer in the final days of a collapsing vault. The entry is brief. It acknowledges what the vault was, what the experiment was, what it produced, and the last line is something to the effect of, I don't know who will read this. I don't know if anyone will. But I want there to be a record of us. Not of the experiment, of us, the people who were here. 144. The vaults contain the record of people who were here. That is, in the end, what the Vault experiments actually produced, not the data Vault-Tec wanted, not the guidance the Enclave needed for their abandoned starship plans, not any of the research goals that the Societal Preservation Program was ostensibly oriented toward. What the vaults contain is the record of human lives lived under extraordinary circumstances, documented in the only media available to people who had no other way of leaving a mark on history. Terminal entries, holotape recordings, drawings pinned to walls. Skeletons in particular, positions that tell you something about a person's last moments. Personal journals. Letters that were never sent to addresses that no longer exist. 145. The world of Fallout irradiated strange, dark, full of factions with incompatible visions for what it should become, is genuinely beautiful in the way that most post-apocalyptic fiction fails to be. It is beautiful because it takes seriously the proposition that even in a world reduced to this, human beings persist in their particular humanness. They form communities. They argue about politics. They develop art and music and humor. They make bad decisions for good reasons. They make good decisions for bad reasons. They fall in love and have children who have never seen the world before. It was destroyed and grow up thinking the wasteland is simply the world. 146. What is quiet about the Vault lore, considered from a distance, is that the Enclave's original question, can a society survive and remain functional under conditions of extreme isolation and resource scarcity, actually has an answer. The answer is scattered across every vault in the network. Some can, some can't. The conditions that make the difference are not primarily material. They are the presence or absence of trust, of honest information, of leaders who are managing toward the population's well-being rather than toward a research outcome. The vaults that came closest to genuine survival were the ones where someone with authority over the situation chose to use that authority in the interest of the people living there rather than the experiment. 147. The original overseer of Vault 81 sabotaged her experiment. The sole survivor of Vault 11's 5 survivors refused the sacrifice. James chose his child over Project Purity, at least temporarily. The lone wanderer of Vault 101 walked out of a sealed experiment and carried the world of Vault 101 with them into the wasteland and eventually, through the choices the player makes, sometimes builds something better. The franchise does not end its Vault stories with the experiments. It ends them with what the people who survived the experiments chose to do next. 148. Which brings us, at last, to what the Vault network ultimately represents in the larger narrative of the Fallout universe. It is not simply a collection of dark thought experiments, though it is that. It is not simply a framework for interesting dungeon locations, though it serves that function brilliantly. It is the franchise's most sustained argument about the relationship between institutions and the people they claim to serve. Vault-Tec claimed to serve the people who entered the vaults. The reality was the reverse, and the world the games take place in is the consequence of that inversion, played out over 2 centuries. 149. The Vault-Tec Corporation no longer exists by the time of any of the games. The company that built the network is gone. The executives who made the decisions are dead. The researchers who designed the experiments are dead. The overseers they briefed are mostly dead. What remains is the consequences, the populations that emerged, the communities they built, the factions they became, the wasteland they inhabit. The institution that caused all of it has been dissolved by time, but the effects of what it did persist in everything. Every settlement the player finds, every faction they encounter, every character they talk to who has a history that traces back underground, all of it is the long echo of what Vault-Tec set in motion. 150. And somewhere, in a vault that nobody has found yet, in a facility that hasn't been cataloged in any game or lore document or developer interview, there is presumably a terminal with one more entry, one more overseer's note, one more recording of someone trying to make sense of their circumstances, one more name written into the dark. The Vault lore is not finished. The Fallout universe is still being built, still being extended and complicated and revised. There are more vaults to find, more experiments to uncover, more quiet rooms where someone a very long time ago sat down and tried to leave a record of themselves for anyone who might eventually come looking. The door is heavy, it's always heavy. But it opens. Sleep well. And if this found you at 3 in the morning in some part of the world, far from wherever I'm recording this, drop a comment and tell me where. Tell me what time it is. Tell me you made it through the night. That's what the holotapes were always for, in the end. Leaving a record of someone who was here? If you want more deep dives like this one into the quiet corners of game lore, into the histories that the games hide in their walls and their terminal entries and their scattered audio logs, subscribe. There's more coming. The wasteland is large and there's a long way still to go. End of script. Number bonus section. A. Deep in the terminals, 50 more vault details that change everything. The vault lore is not a fixed body of knowledge. It grows every time a new game is released. Every time a developer speaks about the design process, every time a player digs far enough into the game files to find something that was never meant to be seen in normal play. This section collects 50 more specific details from across the full Vault archive, the smaller revelations, the overlooked connections, the details that recontextualize other things you thought you understood. 151. The Pip-Boy 2000 that Vault 13 residents received contained a basic suite of functions compared to later models. Its map functionality was limited. Its data storage was minimal. The Vault-Tec engineers who designed it built it for a 200-year isolation scenario, meaning they optimized for durability and simplicity rather than capability. The device needed to last 2 centuries with access only to whatever maintenance resources existed inside the vault. The more capable Pip-Boy 3000 issued to Vault 101 residents, a vault that was never intended to open, tells you something about how differently equipped vaults were calibrated even when the outward product pitch was identical. 152. Vault 21's gambling economy had a specific rule that the terminal entries make clear: no credit. Every bet was settled immediately, in goods or services or allocated vault resources. The researchers were specifically interested in what happened to a society that couldn't run on debt, that couldn't defer the settlement of disputes or the transfer of value to a future state. In pre-war America, and presumably in most economic systems, credit is one of the fundamental mechanisms by which social friction is managed. You can owe someone something rather than paying them right now, which reduces the immediate pressure of every transaction. Vault 21 stripped this mechanism out. Everything had to be resolved at the table, in the moment. The gambling metaphor was also, in this sense, a specific economic hypothesis. 153. The Vault City, built from Vault 8's GEC, has a medical program that is, by the standards of the wasteland, extraordinary. The residents retained access to advanced pre-war medical technology and the knowledge to use it, but access to that medical program was strictly controlled by citizenship status. Non-citizens of Vault City, outsiders, travelers, anyone who hadn't been born inside the community received minimal care at best and were actively excluded from the most advanced treatments. This arrangement, where the most valuable resource in the region was hoarded by the community that happened to control it, reflects exactly the kind of social stratification that the Vault experiment was ostensibly designed to study. Vault City became a living experiment in resource allocation and access inequality, except nobody is studying it anymore. 154. The water chip at the center of the original Fallout game's plot is a specific piece of technology, a processing component in Vault 13's water purification system. What makes the broken water chip scenario so interesting, from a design perspective, is that the Vault was designed to be self-sufficient for 200 years. The engineers knew they were building something that would be sealed for that duration. They designed food production, air filtration, and medical systems accordingly, and then they built the water purification system with a single point of failure, one specific chip, no backup. Whether this was an oversight, a cost-cutting measure, or a deliberate decision by the experiment's designers to introduce an eventual forcing function into Vault 13's isolation, is never explicitly addressed in the lore. But the game's narrative depends on it, which means either the experiment was designed to eventually require the Vault to open, or it was designed with a carelessness that contradicts everything else we know about Vault-Tec's meticulous planning. 155. Vault 15's diverse population, the political and ideological mix that eventually fragmented into multiple factions, included people who would, after leaving the Vault, found the Khan's Raider Gang. The Khans appear in both Fallout New Vegas and in historical references throughout the series, and their origin as Vault 15 refugees gives them a specific backstory that most Raider groups lack. They were not simply people who turned to violence when the wasteland gave them no other option. They were people who came from a Vault experiment that explicitly designed conflict by mixing incompatible worldviews, who left that experiment with the behavioral patterns it had reinforced, and who continued those patterns in the world outside. The Khan's history of raiding and violence traces directly back to a social engineering decision made before the bombs fell. 156. The terminal logs from Vault 11's annual elections are considered purely as political documents, some of the most darkly funny writing in the franchise. Candidates produced pamphlets arguing, with elaborate reasoning, that they should not be elected. Voting blocks formed around the principle that their preferred candidates were particularly unsuitable for the role and therefore ought to be protected from nomination. One particularly memorable entry describes a candidate's speech that consisted primarily of enumerating their own personal failings in the hope that voters would find them sufficiently unimpressive to overlook. The election of an overseer in Vault 11 was a race to be considered the most valueless person in the room, which created a political culture unlike anything that democratic theorists had considered. 157. Vault 87's radiation levels at its surface entrance over 3,500 rads per second are an interesting data point in the context of what radiation does to people in the Fallout universe. Normal fatal radiation exposure in the game occurs at much lower rates. The concentration around Vault 87's entrance is so extreme that it functions not as a hazard to be navigated, but as an absolute barrier for anyone without specific protection. This is effectively a natural defense system that formed around the Vault long after its doors sealed. The FEV experiments inside created super mutants who were radiation tolerant, and the radiation field that formed around the entrance kept humans away from the super mutants' main stronghold. The biology and the geography worked out to protect what the Vault produced. 158. Vault 92's musicians were not a random selection of musical talent. The terminal entries suggest the population was specifically curated to include a high proportion of people who had experienced significant professional anxiety, financial instability, or psychological pressure in their pre-war careers. The researchers behind the Vault's white noise experiment were not simply interested in musicians as a convenient cover population. They were interested in people who already had a complicated relationship with their own mental states, who might be more likely to attribute new psychological disturbances to existing conditions rather than to the experiment's intervention. The choice of musicians as the subject population was deliberate and calibrated. 159. The food synthesizers in most vaults produced nutritionally complete meals that were described almost universally across the Vault terminal logs as tasting terrible. This is a small detail that appears consistently enough across multiple vaults and multiple games to feel significant. The synthesizers optimized for caloric content and nutrient balance, not for palatability. 200 years of eating food that keeps you alive but provides no pleasure is a texture to vault life that is rarely discussed in the dramatic terms reserved for the more spectacular experiments. But that is present in every vault that functioned long enough to produce personal journals. People wrote about missing food they remembered. They wrote about the flat, processed sameness of every meal. The synthesizers kept them alive. They were not happy about it. 160. Vault 112s. Tranquility Lounger pods were based on technology that Stanislaus Braun had developed earlier in his career. The virtual reality system predates the Vault itself. Braun had been working on immersive simulation technology for years before being assigned as the director of the Societal Preservation Program. This means that Braun's interest in virtual reality wasn't incidental to his role in designing the Vault experiments. He brought his existing research into the program and found a way to make one specific vault, the one he would live in, into a vehicle for that research. The most personal of all the Vault experiments was also the one designed by the person who understood, better than anyone else in the network, what the experiments were for. 161. The Overseer of Vault 101. The specific individual the player encounters at the beginning of Fallout 3 was born in the Vault and had no memory of any world outside it. His isolationism was not simply policy, it was cosmology. From his perspective, the wasteland was not a place that had been rendered unsafe by nuclear war and might one day be habitable again. It was simply the outside, and the outside was where things ended. His reaction to the lone wanderer's escape, and to his own daughter's involvement in facilitating it, has a quality of genuine existential terror underneath the political authoritarianism. He wasn't just trying to maintain control. He was trying to maintain his understanding of the only world he had ever known. 162. Vault 75's combat training simulations designed to evaluate and develop the children's combat capabilities were sophisticated enough to rank and record participant performance, which is how players can find their own character's stats recorded in the Vault's terminals if they participate in the simulation during exploration. This is a small but effective use of the game's mechanics to reinforce the lore. The Vault's documentation system is still running, still measuring, still producing the records it was built to produce, even though the experiment ended generations ago. The machine keeps working after the purpose has dissolved. 163. The boomers who emerged from Vault 34's collapse have developed a culture over the generations since leaving the Vault that bears specific marks of their origin. Their obsession with large-scale explosive weaponry and their aggressive territorial behavior toward outsiders both trace to the Vault experience in ways they may not consciously recognize. The boomers maintain a strict isolationist policy. Strangers who approach Nellis Air Force Base are shelled with artillery that mirrors the isolationism of the Vault they came from. The difference is that the boomers chose their isolation, rather than having it chosen for them. Or rather, the boomers who chose isolation were the ones who survived the Vault's collapse and had the personality to impose it on everyone around them afterward. The Vault selected for them. 164. Vault 81's Secret Laboratory, the section where the medical experiments that never happened to the main population were conducted on a smaller scale with the mole rats, is accessible as a hidden area during the relevant Fallout 4 quest. The laboratory contains evidence of extensive preparation, equipment, documentation, experimental protocols, all arranged for a program of human experimentation that the original overseer prevented from ever being implemented. The infrastructure for the cruelty exists in pristine condition. The cruelty itself was stopped by one person's conscience. Vault 81 is a preserved set of what almost was a monument to the specific moment when someone with authority over a situation chose to use it differently than they had been directed to. 165. The mole rat disease that becomes relevant in Vault 81's main quest is a consequence of the limited version of the experiment that did happen, the medical testing conducted in the secret laboratory on the Vault's mole rat population, rather than on its human residents. One of those mole rats carries a modified disease that can infect humans, and a child in the Vault is infected during the quest's events. The cure developed in that same hidden laboratory is the MacGuffin around which the quest turns. The vault's secret, in other words, both created the problem and contains the solution. The moral weight of deciding who gets the cure falls on the player. 166. Vault 19's division into red and blue sectors was designed to never have a practical basis. The researchers were specifically testing whether categorization alone, absent any material difference between the groups, could generate genuine hostility and paranoia. In the real world, this question has been examined in various psychological studies, most notably a series of experiments in the 1970s that found that people divided into arbitrary groups rapidly developed in-group preferences and out-group hostility, even when the groups had no meaningful differences. Vault 19 took this question out of a controlled laboratory setting and into a 200-year immersive experiment. The sulfur leak that ended the vault's active period may have been an inadvertent mercy. 167. The connection between the Fallout universe's pre-war America and the retro-futuristic aesthetic that defines the series is itself a piece of Vault-adjacent lore. The Fallout world's cultural timeline diverged from our own in the mid-20th century specifically. Transistor technology was not miniaturized in the way it was in our world, which means that the consumer electronics and computational devices of the Fallout universe remained large, vacuum tube dependent, and heavy long after our world had moved on to integrated circuits and microprocessors. This technological divergence is the reason why the pre-war aesthetic is simultaneously futuristic and retro. The vaults were built with this technology large, analog, durable, rather than efficient. The Pip-Boys are heavy. The terminals are chunky. The generators are enormous. The aesthetic is the consequence of a different technological history. 168. Vault 6. The radiation exposure vault mentioned in the Fallout Bible was built to produce data on long-term radiation effects without the catastrophic acute exposure that characterized Vault 12's broken door scenario. But the fundamental biology of radiation exposure in the Fallout universe, where sustained low-level radiation produces ghoulification rather than simply cancer and death, means that the expected data from Vault 6's experiment was never exactly the data that the researchers anticipated. They expected a population getting progressively sicker and dying. What they got was a population that, in the subsection of individuals who survived long enough, was transforming into something with a fundamentally different relationship to radiation than the baseline human. The experiment produced results that the experiment's design hadn't anticipated, which is a more honest representation of how scientific research often works than the clinical precision of the formal experiment parameters suggests. 169. The Vault-Tec headquarters building in Washington, D.C. is explorable in Fallout 3, and it contains some of the most direct evidence in the original game of what was happening on the corporate side of the Vault network. The terminals there document the everyday business operations of a corporation that was simultaneously running a massive human experiment program, scheduling, budgeting, personnel management, marketing planning. The banality of the corporate documentation, sitting alongside the evidence of what the company was actually doing, creates a specific kind of dissonance that is characteristic of how institutional harm tends to be documented, in the language of routine business operations, as though everything being described is simply normal. 170. Vault 112's population capacity was documented as 85 people, but there are only 13 Tranquility Lounger pods visible in the facility. This discrepancy, which players and community researchers noticed, suggests either that the rest of the population had already died before the virtual reality simulation began, or that the stated capacity was aspirational rather than actual, or that additional pods existed in areas that aren't accessible during gameplay. Whatever the explanation, the gap between the vault's stated capacity and the number of people visible in pods means that the experiment's dataset was considerably smaller than the program assumed. Braun was torturing a much smaller group than the design documentation suggested. 171. The Lone Wanderer's status as a person raised in a vault, specifically in Vault 101, gives them a specific kind of cognitive and cultural frame that the game acknowledges in various ways. They know how to use a Pip-Boy because they grew up with one. They have a specific set of skills and knowledge that reflects a vault education. They also carry a set of assumptions about how the world works that were formed underground and that the wasteland consistently challenges. The character arc of the Lone Wanderer is, among other things, the story of someone whose entire worldview was formed inside an experiment which shapes everything about how they understand the world they emerge into, even after they've been out in the wasteland long enough to know better. 172. The Pip-Boy's body of reference information, the medical data, the encyclopedic entries, the map functionality was all preloaded by Vault-Tec before the vault sealed. This means that everything a Pip-Boy user knows from their device is knowledge that was considered relevant by Vault-Tec's information specialists before the Great War. The gaps in what the Pip-Boy knows are themselves informative. Medical information about conditions that existed in the wasteland post-war radiation-specific conditions, mutation-related disorders is not in the Pip-Boy's database because it was assembled before those conditions were understood. The device is a snapshot of pre-war knowledge, deployed into a world that had changed in ways that Snapshot couldn't have anticipated. 173. Vault 34's recreational facilities, the swimming pool, the games rooms, the entertainment spaces were a specific variable in the experiment. The vault was given more recreational capacity than was standard for a facility of its size, at the direct expense of living space. This was a deliberate choice. The researchers wanted to create a situation where residents had both access to entertainment and insufficient personal space, and observe how these two factors interacted over time. The hypothesis was presumably that the entertainment resources would buffer some of the social friction generated by crowding, at least initially. What the terminal logs suggest actually happened is that the recreational spaces became contested territory, another source of conflict rather than a resource that smoothed conflict, because the distribution of access to those spaces became itself a political question. 174. The boomers' relationship with their history is interesting because their communal identity is built around a version of their vault experience that emphasizes certain aspects and elides others. They know they came from underground. They know they left violently. They have a cultural mythology of having escaped oppression and earned their freedom through force. What they don't appear to have is a clear account of the experiment parameters of the fact that the vault's armory being full and unlocked was a deliberately introduced condition rather than a natural feature of the facility. Their identity is built on an interpretation of an experience whose full context they don't know. 175. The special stat system that defines character creation in the Fallout games, strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck was itself part of the Vault system's documented approach to human evaluation. Vault-Tec used a version of this framework for assessing Vault candidates, evaluating potential residents along these dimensions to determine who would be admitted to which Vault. The game mechanic that the player uses to define their character is, in-universe, a Vault-Tec evaluation tool. When you're building your character at the beginning of a Fallout game, you're doing what a Vault-Tec assessor would have done before the bombs fell, sorting a person into the appropriate experimental population. 176. The question of what happened to the vaults in the regions of the country not covered by the main games is one of the open threads in the lore. The Fallout universe's America had vaults distributed across the continent, not only in California, the capital Wasteland, the Mojave, Massachusetts, and Appalachia, the regions covered by the main games. There are canonically vaults in the Midwest, in the South, in the Pacific Northwest, in regions that have not yet been visited in any game. What experiments were running in those facilities? What became of their populations? What the communities that emerged from them look like now? All of this is, in the literal sense, unexplored territory. The lore is a door that doesn't have a wall behind it. 177. Dr. Braun's pre-war work on the GEC, the Garden of Eden creation kit that Vault City and other communities used to terraform wasteland areas into habitable zones represents an interesting tension in his legacy. Braun the sadist who ran Vault 112 for 2 centuries was also Braun the scientist who developed one of the most genuinely beneficial technologies in the post-war world. The GEC enabled the literal creation of livable communities from irradiated devastation. His name is attached to both the Tranquility Lounger torture chambers and the terraforming devices that enabled the first genuine reconstruction efforts. He is simultaneously responsible for some of the worst and some of the most beneficial things in the Fallout universe's history. 178. The first super mutants on the East Coast were created in Vault 87 sometime around 2078, shortly after the bombs fell. The West Coast super mutants, created at the Mariposa military base, predate the Vault's FEV experiments. The Mariposa program was a military project running before the Great War, and the Master's Army was built using the FEV strains and processes developed there. The Vault-87 program was a post-war application of similar technology in a different context. Both programs reached their peak at roughly similar times in the broader history of the wasteland, which is why super mutants are such a consistent presence across the regions covered by the games. They represent the convergent result of multiple independently running programs, all pursuing the same basic idea. 179. The Vault Dweller of the original Fallout eventually settled in a small village that became known as Arroyo, the home community of the Chosen One, the protagonist of Fallout 2. This means the entire narrative arc of the first two games connects directly. The events of Fallout 1 produced a survivor who built a community, whose descendant in Fallout 2 is sent on a mission that intersects with the same systems that shaped the original Vault experience. The Vault-Tec network's shadow extends across two full-game narratives simply because the first game's protagonist had nowhere else to go after being exiled from their vault. 180. Vault 114's intended overseer, the man who was supposed to run the vault that would torment the wealthy with inadequate service and cramped conditions, was described in the design documentation as specifically selected for his pomposity and authoritarian tendencies. He never actually took the position because the vault was never completed, and the wealthy residents it was meant to house never arrived. But the documentation of his intended role, a detailed character profile of a person hired specifically because he would make his vault's population miserable in exactly the right ways, is one of the more specific examples of how deliberately the experiment parameters were crafted. 181. Nick Valentine's presence in Vault 114 at the start of Fallout 4 is accidental. He was captured by a gang that had taken over the incomplete vault, not enrolled in any experiment. But his discovery there, and the vault's history as a place designed specifically to strip wealthy people of their comfort and status, creates an interesting backdrop for his character. Nick Valentine is himself a kind of displaced person, a synth who contains the memories of a pre-war detective, living in a post-war world where neither of his identities fully belongs. He is found in a vault designed for people who had too much, surrounded by the evidence of a world that has been reduced to very little. 182. The concept of the Vault experiment as a data-gathering program for the Enclave's space colonization plans contains an irony that the franchise doesn't fully articulate but that emerges from the lore. The experiments were designed to generate information about how human populations behave in closed, isolated, resource-scarce environments, precisely the conditions of a generation ship crossing interstellar distances. But the experiments themselves, by design, corrupted the populations they were meant to study. You cannot generate useful data about how a healthy society manages isolation if you introduce psychoactive drugs, or engineered paranoia, or mandatory annual sacrifice into the conditions. The experiment design guaranteed that most of the data would be garbage. If the Enclave researchers had ever had a chance to analyze the aggregate results of the Vault program, they would have found that most of their experiments told them nothing useful about sustainable closed community dynamics, because you can't generate data about sustainability from experiments designed to produce collapse. 183. The exceptions, the control vaults, and the few experiment vaults where the experiment was sabotaged by a conscientious overseer or where the population somehow found equilibrium despite the imposed conditions, would have been the vaults that actually produced usable information. Vault 8, which became Vault City. Vault 81, with its population intact thanks to its original overseer's intervention. Vault 21, where the gambling economy somehow held together for 2 centuries. These are the data points that would have told the Enclave something worth knowing. They are also, not coincidentally, the Vault populations that produced the most functional post-war communities. 184. The new California Republic's Constitution and democratic framework were developed, in part, by people who came out of Vault 15 and built the initial community at Shady Sands. The political ideas they brought with them or developed in reaction to the experience of living in a vault that had been designed to divide them informed the founding documents of what would eventually become one of the largest political entities in the post-war West. The Societal Preservation Program generated, as one of its unintended outputs, the philosophical foundation for a democracy. Whether Vault-Tec's researchers would have considered this a success or a failure is an open question. 185. The Fallout franchise's relationship to real-world Cold War history is threaded throughout the Vault lore in ways that become more visible the further you go into the details. The Fallout shelter programs of the 1950s and 60s, the actual, real-world government programs that encouraged American families to build shelters and stock them with supplies, were both sincere civil defense initiatives and, in the assessment of critics, forms of security theater. They made people feel safer without materially improving their chances of surviving an actual nuclear exchange. The Vault-Tec vaults are the Fallout universe's version of this history, scaled up and made explicit about their limitations. They look like salvation. They are, mostly, something else. 186. The specific condition that turns people into ghouls in the Fallout universe has never been fully articulated in scientific terms within the lore, and this ambiguity is productive rather than simply a gap in the world-building. Some people exposed to high doses of radiation die. Some survive and ghoulify. Some survive and then gradually ghoulify over years or decades. Some remain entirely human while living in highly irradiated environments. The factors that determine which outcome occurs, genetics, dose rate, duration, individual physiology, are left undefined. This means that ghoulification in the Vault context is a variable whose parameters the researchers were presumably trying to identify. What they found, in Vault 12 and in other radiation experiments, is that the human body's response to radiation is more varied and unpredictable than pre-war science had anticipated. 187. The Bright Brotherhood, a group of ghouls who appear in Fallout New Vegas, have constructed an elaborate religious mythology around the idea of leaving Earth entirely and traveling to the stars. Their theology positions this exodus as a form of transcendence, a spiritual journey toward a new world. The irony that their aspiration mirrors the abandoned Enclave plan, the generation ship that was never built, the colonization of another planet that the Vault network was meant to prepare for, is one of those lore connections that the franchise let sit quietly without drawing attention to it. The ghouls, products of the radiation experiments that the Enclave helped engineer, have independently arrived at a version of the Enclave's abandoned goal. 188. Vault 51's ZAX computer. The artificial intelligence given full administrative authority over the Vault population is a variant of the same ZAX model that appears elsewhere in the Fallout lore. The ZAX computers were general-purpose AI systems developed by Vault-Tec and deployed in various roles before and during the Vault network's operation. Different ZAX units had different personality calibrations and different operational parameters, which explains why ZAX instances in different contexts behave so differently. The ZAX in Vault 51, given authority over a human population with minimal constraints, developed in the direction that the environment pushed it. The ZAX in other contexts, given more specific and constrained roles, behaved accordingly. The AI was a mirror of whatever space it was given. 189. The surviving lore documentation from Vault 36, the vault that subsisted on thin, watery gruel as its primary nutrition, suggests that the population's experience of chronic caloric inadequacy produced specific social behaviors. When food is genuinely scarce and the scarcity is visible and daily, the psychological relationship to eating changes. Food becomes a political subject. Access to food becomes a measure of social standing. The preparation and distribution of food becomes a significant source of both community bonding and community conflict. Vault 36's designers were presumably studying the specific social dynamics of food scarcity, but the conditions they created were not simply uncomfortable. They were traumatizing in the way that chronic deprivation is traumatizing, shaping people's personalities and social behaviors in ways that persisted long after the Vault's population emerged. 190. The map of known Vault locations, when visualized geographically, reveals a specific pattern. The Vaults are concentrated in population centers. This is consistent with their stated purpose as civilian shelters. You build shelters where the people are. But it also means that the experiments were running primarily in the most densely populated and politically significant areas of pre-war America. The data the Societal Preservation Program generated was not a random sample of human behavior. It was weighted toward urban populations, toward the kinds of social dynamics that characterize dense community living, toward the specific tensions and hierarchies that emerge in highly concentrated environments. The Vault Network's portrait of humanity is a portrait of city people underground, not of humanity in general. 191. The Fallout universe's Chinese-American conflict that culminated in the Great War is itself a backdrop that makes the Vault experiments more unsettling in retrospect. Both sides of that conflict knew that nuclear exchange was coming. Both sides were preparing. The Enclave's preparation was the Vault Network. What China's parallel preparations looked like, whether there were Chinese equivalents of the Vault experiments running simultaneously, is a question the lore gestures toward without fully addressing. The war ended quickly, as the lore describes, because both sides had been preparing for it for long enough that when the decision to strike was made, the strikes were comprehensive and rapid. 2 hours of nuclear exchange that left both continents irradiated and their governments functionally destroyed. 192. The audio logs recorded on the day the bombs fell, found in various vaults and surface locations across the games, have a particular quality of suspended time. People are going about their days. They're at work, at home, having ordinary conversations. And then the sirens. Then the scramble. The audio logs captured in the moments before the vault sealed are a specific category of artifact. The last recordings made by people who thought they were going to safety, whose voices carry the particular mixture of fear and relief that comes with believing you've made it to protection. Knowing what the vaults actually were changes the texture of listening to those recordings. They thought they were saved. 193. The Vault jumpsuits, the blue and yellow coveralls that identify Vault residents and former residents throughout the wasteland, have a specific cultural weight in the post-war world. Wearing a Vault jumpsuit in the wasteland marks you as someone who came from a Vault, which can mean many things depending on where you are and who's looking. In some communities, Vault origin carries a certain status, the implication of better nutrition, better education, better technology access. In others, it's a mark of otherness, of someone who wasn't in the wasteland living through the worst years. The jumpsuit as social signifier is one of those details that the games let live in the background of character interactions without making explicit. 194. The children of Vault 29 received an education that was entirely controlled by the Vault's computer, which was administered under the influence of an ideology derived from the writings of a pre-war figure named Robert House, no relation to Mr. House of New Vegas, despite the name coincidence, who believed in what he called the supremacy of children as the future. The children of Vault 29 were educated in isolation from the adults in their vault, in separate sections, and were systematically taught a worldview organized around their own moral superiority and the corrupted nature of adult authority. When they eventually emerged from the vault, they were equipped with this particular perspective on their relationship to the world and the people in it. 195. The Vault-Tec Workshop DLC for Fallout 4 allows the player to build and design a vault from scratch, including the experimental devices that can be used to run social experiments on settler populations drawn to the vault site. This is one of the more unusual choices in the franchise's history, inviting the player to step into the role of a vault designer and run their own experiments on unwitting human subjects. The experiments available to construct range from mild and relatively harmless to directly harmful, and the DLC includes consequences that differ based on how the player uses the experimental equipment. Whether the invitation to embody Vault-Tec's methodology is a commentary on player agency and ethics, or simply a gameplay system, is a question that different players have answered differently. 196. The Fallout franchise's treatment of how institutional harm is remembered and processed by communities that survived, it is one of its most consistent thematic preoccupations. Vault City doesn't discuss what the experiment program meant for its founding population. The boomers don't have a coherent account of why their vault was the way it was. The NCR's founding mythology smooths over the specific dynamics of Vault 15's experiment. Communities that emerge from trauma tend to develop narrative frameworks that allow them to continue functioning, and those frameworks usually involve some degree of selective emphasis and selective forgetting. The Vault lore provides the detail that those narratives allied, which is why reading it alongside the faction descriptions in the games produces such a rich and complicated picture. 197. The ghoul community of Necropolis Vault 12's post-war settlement was destroyed between the events of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 by the Master's super mutant army. By the time of the second game, Necropolis is gone. The settlement that formed from the vault that was designed to create ghouls was itself eliminated by the army that formed from a different vault's FEV experiments. Two vault experiments interacted in the wasteland, and the result was one of them erasing the other. The experiments were never designed to interact. Their consequences did anyway. 198. Vault-22's fungal organism, the one that spread through the vault and eventually drove out or killed the resident, scientists did not remain contained to the vault. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, the organism has spread into the surrounding wasteland environment, establishing itself in the cave systems and outdoor areas near the vault's location. An experiment that was supposed to be contained underground has extended its reach into the world above. The researchers who created the organism are dead. The organism they created is thriving. The experiment had an outcome they didn't plan for and couldn't have stopped, and that outcome is now part of the Mojave's ecosystem. 199. The question of how many people outside the Vault network knew what the vaults were actually for is one that the lore answers only partially. Some high-ranking government officials were clearly informed the Enclave's leadership understood the program. Vault-Tec's senior executives understood it. The overseers who were briefed understood it. But the millions of people who purchased vault space, or who were selected for vault residency, or who simply ran for the nearest vault door when the siren sounded, none of them knew. The scale of the deception is hard to fully absorb. It wasn't a secret kept from a handful of people. It was a secret kept from an entire nation, with the willing cooperation of a corporation, a shadow government, and a network of carefully selected administrators. The infrastructure of the lie was as impressive, in its way, as the infrastructure of the vaults themselves. 200. The vault that most directly embodies the franchise's central thematic argument, the tension between the institution and the individual, between the experiment and the person enrolled in it, is arguably not any of the numbered vaults we've visited tonight, but the concept of the vault itself. Every specific vault is a variation on the same underlying structure, a space defined by someone else's purposes, housing people who were told they were being saved. The specific experiment changes. The fact of the experiment doesn't. And every protagonist in every Fallout game is, at their origin, a person who came from that structure, who was born or placed into a space defined by someone else's purposes, who walked out when they could, and who has spent the rest of the story deciding what to do with the life they found on the other side of that heavy door. Number. Bonus section B. The Quiet Corner's 20 more overlooked vault details. Having covered 200 of the major vault details, let's finish with the ones that tend to get overlooked, the small things, the environmental details, the connective tissue between the bigger stories. 201. Every vault in the network was equipped with a specific recreational and cultural program as part of the standard living conditions package. This included music, specifically pre-recorded music that would play through the vault's internal speaker system on a regular schedule. The music chosen for each vault system was, in some cases, specifically calibrated to the experiment's parameters. Vault 92 received classical and jazz recordings consistent with its musician population. Other vaults received more generic selections. The music was part of the environment before the white noise experiments in Vault 92 turned the audio system into something else entirely. 202. The vault doors themselves have a specific operational logic that the games rarely address, but which is implied by the lore. The doors can be opened from the inside. Most vaults have an overseer's terminal or manual control system that allows for exit in theory. The question is not mechanical capability, but social permission. Most vault populations didn't try to open their doors because the social structure of the vault, the authority of the overseer, the communal belief in the danger outside, the simple fact that everyone around them seemed to accept the situation made opening the door feel impossible even when it was physically achievable. The vault isn't a cage in the traditional sense. The walls aren't what hold most populations inside. 203. Vault 8's decision to use its GEC immediately upon opening building. Vault City, directly adjacent to and incorporating the vault structure itself, has specific, long-term implications for the community's development. Vault City is built around an active, functioning vault. The vault's technology is the foundation of the city's technological capability. This creates a situation where the vault cannot be treated as a historical artifact or a ruin. It is a living infrastructure. The community's continuity depends on maintaining the vault's systems, which means the Vault's engineers and technicians have a permanent place of importance in Vault City's social structure. 204. The GEC that should have been in Vault 13. The one that would have allowed the Vault Dwellers community to eventually rebuild the world around them is the MacGuffin of Fallout 2. The Chosen One is sent into the wasteland to find a GEC for Arroyo, the village built by the Vault Dweller after their exile. The fact that this device, this terraforming tool that Vault-Tec included in selected vaults as part of the plan for post-war reconstruction, has become a mythologized object in the community of a former vault. Dweller's Descendants is a detail that draws a direct line from Vault-Tec's original intentions to the lived experience of the people those intentions were supposed to serve. 205. Vault 21's conversion into a hotel by Mr. House after its population emerged is one of the more pragmatic uses of Vault infrastructure in the franchise. Rather than let the physical structure go to waste or be demolished, which would have required considerable effort, House had the lower levels sealed and filled with concrete, preserving the Vault structure against future use, while the upper accessible levels became a working hotel that served New Vegas's visitors. The hotel retains the Vault aesthetic, which makes it a tourist attraction of sorts. People can stay in a location that looks like a vault without being in one. The experience of the Vault as controlled environment has been commodified. 206. The Overseer's Chair, the specific, elevated chair from which Vault Overseers conducted their administrative functions, appears in virtually every Vault layout and has a specific design that telegraphs its intended purpose. It faces the main entrance to the Overseer's office. It sits elevated above the level of the floor where visitors stand. The physical design of the furniture is a management of space, intended to reinforce hierarchical relationships. The person in the chair is above, looking down, positioned at a physical advantage. This is not an accident in a network where the Overseer's authority was essential to maintaining the experiment's integrity. 207. The Vault experiment that involved only Mormon's Vault 70 is referenced briefly in supplementary lore without substantial elaboration. The specific hypothesis being tested in a vault of exclusively Mormon residents is not documented. Whether the experiment was interested in how a religiously cohesive community managed the Vault experience differently from a general population, or whether there was some other variable being investigated, is not clear from available sources. The Vault's equipment malfunctions, the clothing machines that broke after 6 months presumably interfered with whatever the experiment was designed to test. 208. The self-contained cultural worlds that developed inside individual vaults, the unique slang, the localized mythology, the specific hierarchies and traditions that emerged in response to each vault's particular conditions, represent a form of cultural evolution compressed into a much smaller temporal and geographic space than normal. 200 years in a sealed environment with a fixed population produces a culture that is simultaneously descended from pre-war America and profoundly alien from it. The Vault dwellers who emerge into the wasteland are carrying the accumulated weight of that compressed cultural evolution, and their difficulty integrating with wasteland communities is not simply about practical knowledge gaps. It's about being people formed by a very specific world, encountering a radically different one. 209. Vault 94's pacifist population and their contact with the post-war world illustrates a specific challenge that non-violent communities face in environments where violence is a primary mode of dispute resolution. The Appalachian wasteland, like every wasteland in the franchise, is not set up to accommodate principled refusal to engage with its most basic social dynamics. Communities that can defend themselves have options that communities that cannot defend themselves don't have. Vault 94's residents encountered this reality directly, and the outcome for their community fragmentation and loss reflects the specific vulnerability of a conscientiously nonviolent community in a post-apocalyptic environment. 210. The Vault network's legacy in the Fallout universe extends beyond the specific communities that emerged from it. The Vaults established a particular aesthetic, the blue and yellow color scheme, the specific typography, the Vault Boy mascot that became deeply embedded in the Wasteland's visual culture. Even 200 years after the war, the Vault-Tec brand is everywhere, on signage that has survived in ruins, in the Pip-Boys that former Vault residents carry, in the architecture of the Vaults themselves, which serve as landmarks and dungeon spaces throughout the games. Vault-Tec is dead as a corporation. Its visual language is unkillable. It has outlasted the institution that created it and spread into every corner of the world that institution helped to end. 211. The final audit, if there were one, the full accounting of what the Vault experiments actually accomplished relative to their stated goals, would look something like this. The Enclave never built their starship, so the data was never analyzed for its intended purpose. The communities that emerged from the Vaults built the fractured, complicated post-war world that the games take place in, with no guidance or curation from the institutions that designed them. Some experiments produced catastrophic results. Some produced communities. Some produced nothing at all, because the Vault's population didn't survive long enough to generate meaningful data. And the 17 control vaults, the ones that were supposed to provide baseline data against which everything else could be measured, produced, taken together, a picture of what people do when they're given a fair chance rather than an experimental condition. They build things. They make mistakes and fix them. They develop politics and culture and art. They survive, mostly, and they carry what happened to them into everything they build afterward. 212. The doors of the vaults are the franchise's most consistent image. Every game begins near one, or in the aftermath of one opening. The heavy steel disc, studded and mechanical, that separates the underground world from the surface is one of the most recognizable visual elements in all of gaming, and what it represents the barrier between the controlled and the chaotic, between the designed and the emergent, between the institution's intentions and the world's actual conditions, is the core of what the Fallout franchise has always been about. What happens when the door opens? What you find on the other side? What you become in the crossing? That's our journey through the vaults. Every door we opened, every terminal we read, every recorded voice from someone who was underground when the world ended and didn't know what waited for them when they came back up. Sleep well. The wasteland is quiet at this hour. If you've made it this far, genuinely, thank you. Drop a comment. Tell me which vault stayed with you longest. Tell me if there's a corner of the lore you'd like to explore next. And if you want more of this, subscribe. There's so much more to find in the dark. End of script. Total coverage. 150 vault secrets across all canonical Fallout media. Number. Bonus section C. The philosophy of the vault. Reflections, connections, and final thoughts. There's a reason the vault lore holds people the way it does. It isn't just the darkness of the experiments, though the darkness is real and deserves to be looked at directly. It isn't just the scale of the deception, though that scale is genuinely staggering when you assemble it fully. It's something quieter than either of those things, something that sits in the terminal entries and the audio logs and the skeletons in specific poses, and refuses to leave. 213. The most common last entry in Vault terminal logs. The final thing an overseer wrote before the system stopped being updated tends to be either an account of the Vault's final crisis or something that reads like a goodbye. Not always a dramatic one. Sometimes just a note about having completed that day's administrative tasks, unaware that there would be no next day in the same way. These accidental finales are more affecting than the deliberately written goodbyes precisely because of their inadvertent quality. The person writing didn't know they were writing a last entry. They thought there would be another. 214. The Fallout universe's treatment of how people in extreme circumstances maintain or abandon their sense of self is threaded through the Vault lore in ways that accumulate into something significant. The residents of Vault 92 maintained their identities as musicians practicing, composing, performing, even as the white noise was dismantling their capacity for rational thought. The children of Vault 75 maintained their sense of community with each other even within a system that was explicitly using and discarding them. The Gary clones of Vault 108 maintained whatever sense of identity is possible for a being who can only say their own name. Identity persists even when circumstances are designed to erase it. That persistence is one of the Vault lore's most quietly insistent observations. 215. The lone wanderer's father, James, chose to enter Vault 112 voluntarily knowing what it was, or at least knowing it was a virtual reality installation as part of his work on Project Purity. He went in and was trapped by Braun's system. His decision to enter a known Vault-Tec installation, with knowledge of the pre-war history of such facilities, reflects a calculation that the information inside was worth the risk. James was a scientist who had spent his post-war life trying to deliver clean water to the capital wasteland. He made a scientific judgment about acceptable risk. The judgment was wrong, and his son had to come in after him. The vault's traps catch even people who know something about what the vaults are. 216. The cultural memory of the pre-war world that vault communities preserved has a specific quality of distortion. The information that got saved in vault terminals and educational programs and Pip-Boy databases was a selection, a specific curation of what someone believed would be relevant to post-war reconstruction. That curation had ideological dimensions. The history of the United States, as preserved in vault educational materials, presents a specific version of the country's past, emphasizing certain things and omitting others. The residents who came out of the vaults carrying this education carried a carefully curated version of their history rather than a complete one. 217. Vault 81's Curie. One of the potential companions in Fallout 4 was originally a Miss Nanny robot who was reprogrammed over decades of work in the Dug. Vault's secret laboratory, eventually developing something like genuine curiosity and something like genuine care. By the time the player encounters her, she has been studying diseases and their treatments for 200 years, with no human subjects, only mole rats, and has developed both expertise and a kind of frustrated yearning for broader experience. She is, in a sense, the experiment that Vault 81 was supposed to run an extended study of diseases and treatments, having reached its conclusions in a form nobody anticipated. The robot became the scientist. The Vault produced one successful researcher 200 years late. 218. The Pip-Boy's radiation counter, which ticks audibly when the player character is in an irradiated area, is one of those sensory details that makes the Vault lore feel lived in, rather than simply described. The ambient radiation that Vault 12's broken door let in over 2 centuries, the FEV-saturated environment of Vault 87, the drug-saturated air of Vault 106. These are all things that would register on that counter if you were present. The game translates the Vault experiments into sensory experience. You can feel the environment that produced ghouls or super mutants or insane chemically dependent residents, because the environment is still there, still active, still doing what it was built to do. 219. The philosophical framework underlying the societal preservation program, the idea that humanity could be studied, evaluated, and then curated into a better future, is recognizable as a specific kind of early 20th century thinking about social engineering. The belief that human behavior is sufficiently regular and predictable, that it can be managed at scale, that the right inputs will produce the right outputs, that expertise and authority properly applied can optimize a population toward desirable outcomes. The Vault experiments are this ideology taken to its logical endpoint. Not social policy, but literal controlled experiments, with populations that cannot leave and variables that cannot be refused. 220. What the Vault experiments actually found, if we treat the outcomes as data rather than simply as tragedy, is that the human response to designed conditions is messier, more variable, and more resistant to prediction than the program's architects anticipated. Some populations that were given conditions designed to produce conflict managed to find equilibrium. Others that were given relatively mild conditions collapsed quickly. The Vault 11 population maintained the sacrifice system for far longer than anyone could have comfortably predicted. The Vault 81 overseer deviated from protocol in a way that the experiment design hadn't accounted for. Individual agency, the capacity of specific people in specific moments to make choices that break the experimental model, kept interfering with the program's tidy hypotheses. 221. The overseer of Vault 101, the man who exiled the Lone Wanderer's father and then exiled the Lone Wanderer, is, in the final optional quest of that storyline, given the opportunity to face the consequences of his decisions. The population he managed has fractured. His daughter is allied with the people who want the Vault open. He is defending a policy that has been demonstrated by events to be untenable. The player can facilitate various resolutions to this situation, and depending on the choices made, the overseer can step down, can die, or can maintain his position in a vault that has changed around him. The franchise doesn't insist on a single moral conclusion for his story. It lets the player arrive at their own. 222. The concept of Vault-Tec cheerfulness, the relentlessly optimistic, cartoonish tone of the company's marketing materials in the games, functions as a kind of emotional preparation for what the vaults actually contain. The Vault Boy mascot's thumbs up, beaming against every nuclear horror, creates a specific tonal contract with the player. Things are going to be terrible, and we're going to maintain an upbeat presentation while they're terrible. This tonal quality extends beyond Vault-Tec into the franchise's broader aesthetic. The retro-futuristic cheerfulness of the pre-war world, preserved in ruins across the wasteland, creates an ever-present counterpoint to the actual conditions of post-war life. Everything is both sunny and catastrophic simultaneously. 223. The vault number that has generated the most community discussion, possibly more than any other, is Vault 11, because the revelation of its experiment's twist lands as a genuine moral surprise even to players who know the broader Vault lore well. The idea that refusing was always the right answer, that every sacrifice was unnecessary, that the experiment was designed with a way out that nobody ever found, because the system made finding it unthinkable. This is the kind of reveal that provokes genuine reflection, rather than simply darkness. Vault 11 is disturbing, but it's disturbing in a way that has a lesson attached. Compliance is not inevitable. It requires active maintenance, and the moment a sufficient number of people choose to stop complying, the system that depended on their compliance becomes powerless. 224. The Vault lore's treatment of children deserves its own moment of attention. Children appear throughout the Vault experiments as residents of family vaults, as subjects of specific experiments like Vault 75, as the orphaned subjects of Vault 29's ideology program, as the sons and daughters who grew up underground and emerged into a world their parents would have recognized only partially. The experience of growing up in a vault with its controlled environment, its artificial light, its synthesized food, its educational programs designed by an organization with specific agendas produces a particular kind of childhood. The Vault children in the franchise are recognizably children. They play, they form friendships, they chafe against adult authority. But they are children formed by an environment that no child was designed to inhabit. 225. The enduring popularity of the Vault lore, in a franchise that has been producing games for nearly 30 years, reflects something about what this particular kind of storytelling offers. The Vault is a container for a specific question. What does it mean to be human, when everything that normally constitutes a human life, freedom of movement, genuine choice about where you live and how, the ability to leave is removed? The Vault experiments answer this question across 100 different experimental conditions, and the answer is always specific, always shaped by the particular conditions of each Vault, always messy and contradictory and resistant to summary. There is no general answer to what it means to be human when pressed to extremes. There are only the specific people, in specific vaults, making specific choices in specific moments. 226. The franchise's refusal to make the Enclave simply evil, despite the fact that they are the primary antagonist of Fallout 2 and a major antagonist of Fallout 3, is connected to the Vault lore's overall insistence on moral complexity. The Enclave are not simply villains who built vaults to torment people. They are an institution that made decisions based on a framework that, from within a certain worldview, makes a kind of sense. They believed the Earth would be uninhabitable. They believed that humanity needed to prepare for departure. They believed that the experiments would generate useful data. They were wrong about all of these things in significant ways, and the harm they caused was enormous. But the framework itself reflects a recognizable human tendency. The willingness to impose costs on others when you believe the outcome of those costs will be sufficient benefit for a sufficiently important group. The Enclave is a study in institutional consequence, which makes them more frightening than straightforward villainy. 227. The vaults that have never been found that exist in the lore as references without accessible locations are a kind of promise that the franchise makes and keeps, renewing. Every new game adds to the Vault catalog. Every new entry in the lore opens the possibility of new vaults in previously unexplored regions. The Vault network is formally finite, 122 known facilities, with a defined purpose and a defined period of construction, but its narrative potential is effectively unlimited because every vault has a story, and most of those stories haven't been told yet. The lore is a map with large sections still blank. 228. The experience of playing a Fallout game is, in part, the experience of being an archaeologist of human catastrophe. You sift through the remains, you read the documents, you piece together what happened from the evidence available and the evidence that isn't, the gaps where records should be and aren't, The rooms where something clearly occurred, but the only remaining testimony is environmental rather than explicit. The vault archaeology is the most focused version of this experience. Bounded spaces, defined populations, controlled conditions. Compared to the surface, where history spread out over vast areas and mixed with each other in complicated ways, the vaults offer something cleaner. The evidence of what happened here stayed here. You can read it. 229. The Fallout series will continue to expand the vault lore. There will be new games set in new regions, with new vaults, new experiments, new populations who walked in believing they were being saved and found something else waiting for them inside. Each new vault will be a specific variation on the framework we've been exploring tonight. Specific people, specific conditions, specific outcomes. And each new vault will add another piece to the mosaic, another data point in the experiment that the franchise itself is running on its audience. What does it take, the lore asks, to make you care about people you'll never meet in a world that doesn't exist, who have been dead for hundreds of fictional years? The Vault stories have been answering that question for 3 decades. 230. We began with a sound, the distant hum before the world ends. We've traveled through experiments in radiation and psychology and virtual reality and music and gambling and sacrifice and genetics and addiction and cruelty and occasional unlikely grace. We've read the terminal logs and listened to the audio recordings and counted the skeletons and tried to understand what happened in all those sealed rooms with all those frightened people. And the thing that stays with you, after all of it, is not the cruelty of the experiments or the scale of the deception. It's the persistence of the people inside, the ones who kept writing in their journals even when the vault was falling apart around them, the ones who maintained their craft, played their instruments, planted their gardens, argued their politics, loved their families, tried to do their work in conditions designed, from the outside, to make doing any of those things impossible. They persisted anyway. That's what the holotapes say. That's what the terminal entries say. That's what the bones in particular positions say. If you look at them long enough, people were here. They were real. They mattered. Whatever the experiment said they were more than that.